with this unprecedented aggression, accompanied by the Russian machinery of propaganda and lies that aims to distort the reality on the ground, as well as provide a false narrative for this unjustifiable war, we all need to continue to speak out. We all need to continue to tell the truth and continue to mobilize support for collecting and documenting facts on the atrocities committed in Ukraine. Perpetrators of these crimes must be and will be held accountable. We are heartened by the unity of purpose that has emerged with respect to the documentation of war crimes committed in Ukraine. We all agree on the importance of ensuring that anyone responsible for atrocities in Ukraine is held accountable in accordance with the rule of law. And this is also the main purpose of this ARIA formula meeting organized by Albania and France with the cooperation of Ukraine. This meeting will bring together member states and key actors involved in the documentation of crimes committed in Ukraine to identify how such efforts can be supported and further coordinated as to ensure the effective investigation and prosecution of those responsible for such atrocities and war crimes. I would also like to commend and pay tribute to your work, to the work of independent professional investigative journalism, to your colleagues that are working in Ukraine in very difficult and challenging conditions, sometimes putting their own lives at risk to tell the truth behind this senseless war. And it was the horrible photos and reports that emerged from the towns near Kiev that triggered such global revulsion as first evidence of what amounts to be a widespread and systematic use of violence against the civilian population in Ukraine. It is thus essential that all such crimes are thoroughly documented and are ultimately used in a court of law. This event will seek to mobilize all efforts, including the ICC, the Human Rights Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, as well as the Group of Friends on Accountability for Ukraine, also United Nations member states through national prosecutions in states with universal jurisdiction over atrocity crimes or jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, as well as civil society. Justice and accountability should prevail for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian people, but also for the international community as a whole, in order to restore confidence in the international law and in multilateralism that have been so severely damaged by Russia's war of choice. Thank you.
Can we ask a question, please? Can we ask a question?
Is Putin a subject of inquiry?
Stay Hesed.
Good afternoon, everyone. If I may. Good afternoon, everyone. If I may kindly ask you to take your seats so that we can begin. Good afternoon again, and let me begin by warmly welcoming you to the Security Council Area Formula meeting on ensuring accountability for atrocities committed in Ukraine, co-organized by France and Albania in cooperation with Ukraine. It is an honor for me to chair this meeting held at a time when a crime of aggression, a ruthless, unjustified, and unprovoked war is being waged against Ukraine, an independent, democratic, and sovereign country. It is a war that is causing immense suffering, indiscriminate loss of life of civilians, severe and deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure, sexual violence against women, and a humanitarian crisis that is being felt across the globe. We are honored by the wide support we have received from UN members. With 36 of them co-sponsoring our event today, they deserve special mentioning and include Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Colombia, Croatia, Czechia, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Georgia, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Montenegro, Netherlands, New Zealand, North Macedonia, Norway, Poland, Republic of Korea, Romania, Slovakia, Sweden, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, United States of America, as well as the European Union. I'm also grateful to our distinguished speakers for having wholeheartedly answered our call to take part and share their deep insights with us on the crucial question of accountability. I have the honor to welcome the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, ICC Prosecutor Karim Khan, Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Irina Venediktova, and civil society representatives, Ms. Amal Clooney from Clooney Foundation for Justice, and Ms. Ida Sawyer, Director of Crisis and Conflict Division at Human Rights Watch, reporting from the ground. With us here today is also the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, Mr. Kenneth Roth. And without further ado, I would like to invite High Commissioner Bachelet, who is joining us from Geneva via VCT for her briefing. Dear Michelle, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, colleagues, I'm grateful to Albania and France for organizing today's crucial and timely discussion. In the words of a woman from Irpin on the 15th of April after her house burned down, I will quote her, "I'm sad about our house in which I was born and I have lived during my whole life, but I'm even more sad that the whole history of my family burned down." Accountability is a cornerstone of upholding human rights. Yet, 2 months into the Russian armed attack on Ukraine, we ask, who will be held accountable? When and how? As I stated to the Human Rights Council in March, the gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of humanitarian law that have occurred, in particular regarding the principle of distinction and the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, may amount to war crimes. The victims of these violations and their families need reparation. They need to obtain effective remedies for the harm and tragedies they have endured, and efforts aimed at redressing violations must begin now. This sends a clear message that violations of international law will not go unaddressed, that individuals will be held to account, and that parties to the conflict will be held responsible for internationally wrong acts their forces commit. For this to happen, there are at least 4 critical steps. First, the comprehensive preservation of all types of evidence related to alleged international humanitarian and human rights law violations, including digital evidence. Second, decent treatment of all mortal remains, including their proper identification and burial, as well as forensic examinations of bodies to establish cause of death. Third, the effective and comprehensive recording of all deaths linked to the conflict, including civilian casualties. And finally, the development of comprehensive policies and mechanisms to provide remedy and reparations for the victims of serious violations of international law related to the armed conflict since the 24th February 2022, as well as those who suffered harm before, since April 2014. This includes families of those killed and those injured. Individual criminal responsibility for war crimes that may have been committed in Ukraine will have to be determined by a fair trial before a court or tribunal in full compliance with international rule of law standards. This is the primary duty of the parties to the conflict. As the war continues and intensifies, so too does the magnitude of human suffering. We are gravely concerned by the rising civilian death toll, mass displacement, and the destruction of civilians' objectives. As of today, my office has documented and verified 5,939 civilian casualties, with 2,787 killed and 3,152 injured. But actual figures are considerably higher, and my office is working to estimate them. Most of these have been caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, such as shelling from heavy artillery and missile and airstrikes. The staggering scale of human rights violation in Bucha has shocked Ukraine and the world. During a one-day visit, our team documented the unlawful killing, including summary executions of 50 civilians, mostly men, but also women and children. Continue to follow up all reports of violations in Bucha, as well as 300 other allegations of killings, including summary executions of civilians in more than 30 settlements in Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions controlled by Russian armed forces in late February and March. OHCHR has corroborated over 170 cases of apparent arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances of public officials, journalists, and activists in areas controlled by Russian armed forces. OHCHR has also received information about alleged arbitrary and incommunicado detention by Ukrainian forces or people aligned with them. My office is also looking into dozens of allegations of conflict-related sexual violence. The treatment of prisoners of war by the parties also raises serious concerns. Videos apparently recorded by combatants are available online, depicting intimidation, torture, and even killing of prisoners of war. Accountability for these violations and the rights of victims to a remedy and reparations must be ensured. Excellencies, colleagues, my office is committed to engaging with all actors working towards accountability within our respective frameworks and mandates. Here, I welcome the establishment of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, which is an important step. And I emphasize that all efforts should be coordinated with victims' rights, including their protection, at the center of the approaches. Yet, looking at what is playing out today will be in vain if we can't commit to preventing future violations and atrocities. Our efforts for peace must be sustained and unwavering. In the meanwhile, the parties to the conflict must urgently reassess the method used to conduct hostilities. The use of weapons with wide area effects in populated areas should cease immediately. Summary executions, other unlawful killings, and enforced disappearances must come to an end now. My office will continue the crucial work of documenting violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law to guarantee our monitoring is independent and impartial. Our human rights officers must have complete and unimpeded access to all affected areas in Ukraine, as well as access to information. This futile and senseless war has already caused immeasurable human tragedy. Let us commit to putting a stop to it before we have more death, more suffering, and more perpetrators to hold to account. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the High Commissioner for her insightful briefing that sheds light on the horrible suffering inflicted upon civilians. I'd like to highlight the fact that the Office of the High Commissioner uses a strict assessment methodology, and on that basis, it has demonstrated that Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, killing civilians and wrecking hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure, actions that may amount to war crimes. I now would like to give the floor to the Chief ICC Prosecutor Karim Khan to provide his insights on the matter. May I remind everyone that early this month, Prosecutor Khan visited the towns of Bucha and Borodyanka, where there are reasonable grounds to believe that crimes that fall within the jurisdiction of the ICC have been committed. The floor is yours, Prosecutor Khan.
Excellencies, firstly, I'd like to start by thanking the permanent missions of Albania and the Republic of France for convening this session, and it's a real honor, albeit in desperately sad circumstances, to share this platform with the very distinguished panelists and all of the ambassadors and ministers in the room today. We are, by any metric, in a time of massive uncertainty. massive uncertainty for the people of Ukraine, massive uncertainty for the people in the region, and I think it's not hyperbole to say the world is holding its breath. What direction are we going in? Are we heading towards peace, or more violence, more tears, and more suffering? It is a moment, the events particularly since the 24th of February, I think, some have thought, well, what's the point of international law? What's the point of the International Criminal Court? What's the point of all these conventions, all these conferences that many in this room have attended and taken part in, the wonderful drafting, the high, lofty ideals of the preambles? What's the point of it all when people are suffering in so many parts of the world? And yet in that moment of otherwise despair, I think something unique is happening. It is a dawning realization that the rule of law is not a passive spectator, but is an intrinsic part, an intrinsic buckle to keep us together. 43 states have referred the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court. And that's the first time such a number have done such a thing. And I think it is really important to realize, and I think we're seeing it, the young green springs of hope in the wasteland that we otherwise survey, that the law is more relevant now than ever, not only to stop us drifting further apart, but to prevent us colliding with more brutality against one another. I've stated repeatedly, since my first statement when I was in Cox's Bazar on the 25th of February, that the law applies equally to all sides. All parties to the conflict, whether Ukraine or the Russian Federation, whether they're state actors or non-state actors, have certain clear obligations. We've heard from the High Commissioner of Human Rights about the principles of proportionality, the principles of distinction, the types of weapons, munitions, and events that are in the public space of discussion. But this is nothing new. This has been known since Nuremberg. This has been known for a long time. The issue is not a misunderstanding or confusion about the law. It is a greater, an acute realization that the law has to be applied if we are to continue going forward as a species, as communities, as civilization, and as states. I do take the opportunity to really call, both to thank or appreciate Ukraine's declaration under 12.3 of the Rome Statute, because that's the only reason we have jurisdiction, and also to call upon Ukraine with all due dispatch to pass the necessary cooperation law so that the obligations that arose under 12.3 declaration can be properly implemented. At the same time, and I've said it before, but I think it's really important to emphasize in this forum, and I acknowledge also the representative of the Russian Federation. I'm pleased the Russian Federation is in this room, along with the government of Ukraine and so many others. But this is a time when we need to mobilize the law and send it into battle, not on the side of Ukraine against the Russian Federation or on the side of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, but on the side of humanity, to protect, to preserve, to shield people who are children, who are women and who are men, who have certain basic rights. And at that age, at those, whether they are Russian or whether they're Ukrainian is absolutely irrelevant. Their families and their lives are being torn apart. So if this moment is not a moment for us to define and strain our sinews and come together, what moment will we wait for? And will we be alive to see it? You know, when we look at the parties to the conflict in Ukraine, when we look at the Russian Federation and Ukraine, I think, bad though things are, we should pause and look back. You know, as a young child, we all taught history and we love to study it. And one is absolutely staggered by the tremendous suffering that the people of the USSR in today's Russia and today's Ukraine suffered at the hands of National Socialism. Millions upon millions. And in the midst of that particularly bleak catastrophe, we saw perhaps unparalleled heroism and courage. It was in 1943, in the city of Kharkiv, that 30,000 people were killed. And the then USSR decided that accountability was not politicized, it was something necessary. It wasn't a summary executions. 3 Germans and 1 Russian were brought to justice in Kharkiv for the people that were killed and for the crimes that were committed. I think all of us, and the world's not perfect, no state is perfect, no individual is perfect, my office certainly is not perfect, but we need to realize, I think, that we should treat others as we want to be treated. We should conduct ourselves in the way we would like others to conduct themselves. And perhaps, looking back at the events of 80 years ago, we should think, do we want to behave in the way that we prosecuted individuals that were pushing forward the pogroms and the crimes of National Socialism? Or do we wish to hold ourselves to the standard that we held them those years ago? This is a moment of absolute collective unity, and if we don't grasp the moment, I think we will not only be answerable from a moral perspective, I think things, bad though they are, could get worse. We will conduct independent investigations. We will try to hold out the hand of partnerships with states, with civil society, with other organizations, and then subject whatever we receive to proper independent forensic scrutiny. We don't want to be sold a dud. We want to get to the bottom of matters. But at the same time, nobody can be a spectator. The day before yesterday, I did something that has not been done in the life of the ICC before, in the life of the office that I now lead. I signed an agreement to join a JIT, a joint investigation team with Ukraine, with Poland, and with Lithuania. There are 9 other structural investigations underway. And I'm really pleased that the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Irina Vendikova, will be speaking today, and we have other high-level representatives, and I look forward to working together. I've been to Ukraine twice, to Lviv and to Kiev. I've been to Bucha and Borodyanko. The team have been more widely, forensic scientists, lawyers, and investigations. And we will keep on partnering with anybody, but subjecting it, whatever we receive, as I've said, to impartial analysis. I have sent 3 communications to the Russian Federation. I have not received a reply, but I will keep on trying, because I want to say very clearly, and I hope it is relayed, however welcome or otherwise messages may be, I think we have a duty to convey messages, that my office and myself have no agenda, no political agenda, other than to get to the truth. And to the extent there is fake news, to the extent there is collusion or there are attempts to deceive the world, what better way to expose a lie than subject it to independent investigations and analysis? So my door is open. I will also keep knocking on the door, and I hope, for the sake of our own responsibilities, for the sake of our international legal obligations, for the sake of humanity at large and the principles of the UN Charter in whose building we sit, we work with more deliberation, more sincerity, more effectiveness, and try to build trust, because trust can be built even in a battlefield. We see on TV screens, and I've spoken to victims and survivors, pictures that are not fake. I've seen refugees, largely women and children, this caravan of people with their plastic bags and their bags crossing on foot into Poland. I've seen individuals in Borodyanko completely non-scripted, walking around without any supervision, sitting around a blackened kettle in very, very cold temperatures, because that's their current existence at the moment. And of course, I've seen body bags and other evidence of killings, and we need to find out how did people die and who did it, and then insist on accountability. But people have lost everything. People have fled with nothing. So are we to be so self-indulgent as an international community to talk politics when people are scared and children are shivering on all sides? And it doesn't matter if a child is in the Russian-controlled area, or if a child is in the Ukrainian-controlled area, or if a woman... We should view them as our children. We should view them as our family. And unless we have these basic principles permeating our spirit, I really think it is a terrible tragedy. But of course, the law is there, because certain issues are not just of morality, they incur legal responsibility. I think, in short, it's not an overstatement to say that this is a singular moment. It's a critical juncture. The implications, as I said at the outset, are profound in Ukraine, but they extend beyond Ukraine. It's a time to cling to the law. It is a time to uphold the law. If we don't cling with the greatest of respect to the law in this moment, we will be left with nothing to cling to except despair, except suffering. And individually, we cannot allow that to happen. Collectively, we must not rest until it stops, and that sanity and justice prevails on all sides. Thank you so much.
Thank you wholeheartedly, Prosecutor Khan, for the detailed and chilling account. I would like to take the opportunity to appeal to member states to continue supporting the independent work of the ICC prosecutor, which is vital for strengthening accountability for crimes of aggression and crimes against humanity. Further on, the establishment by the Human Rights Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine in early March is a milestone in the swift response of the international community to ensure accountability by using all legal instruments available. The mandate of the Commission is to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law and related crimes in the context of the aggression against Ukraine by the Russian Federation, to establish the facts, circumstances, and the causes of any such violations and abuses. I am pleased to give the floor to the Chair of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, Mr. Eric Moes. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, I would like to thank the organizers, the permanent missions to the UN of the Republic of Albania and of France, for having invited the Commission to this ARIA meeting. This is the first time the Commission appears in a public context. The three commissioners are all present. Mrs. Yasmin Kadzumhur and I are participating remotely, and Mr. Pablo de Graif is physically present at your meeting in New York. Limited time has passed since the President of the Human Rights Council appointed the members of the Commission on 30th March this year. Recruitment of our staff is ongoing, and the office of the Secretariat in Vienna is under establishment. Given this very early stage of the Commission's existence, the three members have considered carefully whether we should participate today. We have decided to do so, demonstrating in a visible way the Commission's availability to communicate with all stakeholders from the beginning. We consider it important to follow discussions of relevance to the Commission's work. Today's topic, accountability for atrocities, is an important element of the Commission's mandate. Ensuring accountability is, of course, only possible with reliable and sufficient evidence. Resolution 49.1 contains several references to the significance of this. The Commission shall investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violation of international humanitarian law and related crimes. It shall establish the facts of any such violations and abuses. It shall collect, consolidate, and analyze such evidence, and systematically record and preserve all information, documentation, and evidence. In performing this huge task, the Commission will build on the work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and work in close cooperation with that mission and with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as mandated by our resolution. The Commission will discuss the implementation of these provisions with the High Commissioner's Office, including during our physical meeting in Geneva in a couple of weeks. We consider this element of our mandate to be important, particularly given the monitoring mission's extensive experience in Ukraine. It's a well-known fact that a large number of entities are investigating the situation in Ukraine, both international and national bodies. As mentioned in the organizer's concept note for this ARIA meeting, there is reason to believe that coordination can ensure the efficiency of investigations, and we intend to look into this issue. Turning specifically to the ongoing ICC investigation, I was very pleased to note the presence of the prosecutor, Mr. Khan, at this meeting. Our Commission will establish contact with the ICC in the near future. More generally, the Commission will seek contact with the parties to the conflict, with victims, civil societies, member states, and other stakeholders. The main purpose is to obtain information of relevance to the mandate. It will be necessary to build upon a broad range of sources which will have to be assessed together. The Commission aims to visit Ukraine and other areas where information and evidence is available. The Commission's broad mandate includes all kinds of allegations, irrespective of whether they receive extensive press coverage or less attention. In conformity with this mandate, the Commission will seek to contribute to accountability. While not a strictly judicial instance, one of its tasks is to identify, where possible, individuals and entities responsible for violation or abuses of human rights, of international humanitarian law, other related crimes. But let me stress that when informing its task, the Commission is, as stated in the mandate, independent. It has no link to any particular country, party, or entity. The Commission will submit its reports to the UN Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly, and its conclusions will be based on the independent assessment of the commissioners and their analysis of the information and evidence that comes out of the investigations. The Commission is, of course, fully aware of the challenges in executing its mandate under the current circumstances, but also of its importance, especially when there are conflicting versions of the facts or even disinformation. In conformity with established principles, the Commission will assess the evidence carefully, giving particular weight to primary evidence and seeking corroboration whenever needed. Over the years, the many commissions of inquiry established by the Human Rights Council have built up a considerable experience in this field. As already mentioned, the Commission finds itself at an early stage of its work, so this is not the time to give long statements. But I would like to thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mrs. Bachelet, for having set up an excellent startup team, which has been of great assistance. And let me end by reiterating that the Commission is ready to communicate with anyone who may assist it in the completion of its mandate. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank Mr. Mols for his valuable remarks, and we look forward to the report of the 3 independent members of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Now I'd like to give the floor to the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Irina Venediktova. May I recall that Ms. Venediktova is visiting the terrain every day and has already opened over 8,000 criminal investigations related to the war and has identified over 500 suspects. Ms. Venediktova, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank permanent missions of Albania and France and other co-sponsoring states for this opportunity to talk with you about the outstanding issue of accountability for international crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. As a Prosecutor General, it is my direct responsibility to document and process crimes committed and ensure their proper and timely prosecution. And of course, accountability for crimes starts with evidence. However, before I proceed with giving you insights about our efforts in this direction, I will take a few moments to inform you what Ukrainian prosecutors are facing on the ground. Violations committed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine are colossal and in their scale and nature. As Madam Bachelet announced recently, international humanitarian law has not merely been ignored, but seemingly tossed aside. Russia's action amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. We also believe that there is a reasonable basis to argue that the pattern of violations acutely resembles the crime of genocide. Russian forces disregard principles and norms applicable to international armed conflicts. From early days, Russia's armed forces indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, targeting civilians and civilian objects, such as hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure. Just dry numbers. According to available data, and this excludes information from areas like Mariupol, where we do not have an access, over 4,300 civilian objects were targeted and majority of them destroyed, including 275 schools, near, even I can give you correct number, 169 kindergartens, over 340 medical facilities, and more than 500 other civilian infrastructure objects. Withdrawal of Russian forces from the Kyiv region yielded insight into the scale of atrocities. We have all seen brutal footage from Kyiv region towns of Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, Hostomel, and others, with bodies with bound hands and clear signs of torture and mutilation lining the streets, bodies of women and children raped and partially burned that lay on cold concrete, or a torture chamber in Bucha where Russian forces tortured peaceful civilians and shot them afterwards. What could be scarier than a torture chamber in 21st century in the vicinity of the capital of European country? We document summary executions of civilians and freshly dug mass graves with hundreds of bodies in there. Evidence strongly suggests that civilians were internationally targeted in widespread and systematic manner, typical of atrocity crimes. This is a common picture in all areas. Direct attacks against civilians is a tactic of intimidation and punishment, since Russia did not manage to achieve its military and policy objective of subjugating Ukraine and Ukrainians. Just to bring one example, Evacuation of civilian population from Mariupol is very difficult. When we were planning evacuation routes, Russian side requested the location of buses via which evacuation would be held. However, once this information was received, they fired at them from howitzers and granates until there was nothing to evacuate. This is the methods of warfare that Russian army is using. About 130,000 civilians, included women, children, and elderly, many of them wounded after merciless attacks and bombardments, are currently in Mariupol, blocked and beginning for rescue. We also observe a worrisome practice for forcible transfer of population and especially children that found themselves in the hands of occupants to Russia. This is another clear violation of international humanitarian law that need to be urgently addressed. To date, near 4,000 civilians were killed, including 217 children and 371 women. Again, this number covers only areas under Ukrainian control. As clearly indicated by the recent report of the OSCE Moscow mechanism, it is inconceivable that so many civilians would have been killed and injured, and so many civilian objects damaged or destroyed if Russia had respected its international humanitarian law obligations in terms of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in conducting hostilities in Ukraine. Let me remind you that the time frame of Moscow mechanism report did not include the atrocities discovered in Bucha and other towns. Russia has also been using explosives such as cluster munitions, munitions with a large blast radius, such as large bombs or missiles, unguided missiles, artillery and mortars, multiple launch rocket systems, as well as incendiary weapons, white phosphorus, and thermobaric bombs, also known as vacuum bombs, in densely populated areas. This is another proof that Russia blatantly disregards its obligation under international humanitarian law. And how Russia reacts to these atrocities? Just several days ago, Putin honored 64th Motor Rifle Brigade, who are responsible for large-scale atrocities in Bucha, with the title of Guards for defending motherland and state interests, and praised that mass heroism and valor, tenacity and courage of its members. This is nothing else but mocking of international law by Russia. These are circumstances that we are faced with. Our objective, however, is clear broadest possible collection of evidence and documentation of every crime to ensure accountability for perpetrators and justice for victims. Evidence gathering and investigation amid war and accessing hotspots is a painstaking work. We have already lost some of our colleagues in the process. However, to date, we have opened over 8,000 investigations into instances of violations of laws and customs of war. This number grows every day. Unfortunately, the volume of crimes and accordingly the evidence that we have to document and work with is extremely capacious, which is a challenge for the National Investigations Authority of Ukraine. We, however, understand that main burden of responsibility for the investigation of crimes rests with Ukraine in accordance with our international obligations. In this process, we are assisted by international community as well as best international experts. I would like to underscore the efforts of Madam Amal Clooney in the format of Legal Task Force on Accountability of Crimes committed in Ukraine with an aim to support Ukraine in delivering justice for victims of international crimes committed by Russia in our country. Apart from domestic jurisdiction and assistance from our friends, there are currently several international efforts underway to seek justice for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other crimes. We are actively cooperating with the Office of Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, which has launched in full-fledged investigation into the situation in Ukraine. We stand ready to do everything in our power to assist the court. We are grateful to Prosecutor Khan for his active engagement and development of effective coordination, and for his actually brave role and his 2 visits to Ukraine give me, some new trust in international humanitarian law. In addition, already 14 national jurisdictions beyond Ukraine have ongoing criminal proceedings regarding international crimes taking place in Ukraine. We cooperate very closely to ensure the maximum efficacy of such criminal proceedings as well as their outcomes. We have established separate joint investigations teams which, with the national authorities of Lithuania and Poland and support of Eurojust to enable to exchange of information, facilitate and strengthen the capacity of investigations into war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other crimes. We are glad that recently ICC team became a part of joint investigation team. This will definitely make our common effort more effective. We are looking forward to cooperation with UN Commission of Inquiry established by Human Rights Council. The rules of war apply to all those who participate in war, from soldiers on the ground to the commander-in-chief. While, as previously noted, wheels of justice for international crimes turn slowly, they do so yielding concrete results, especially in the circumstances of vocal and resounding support of international community. We will use every channel and avenue to enforce accountability for those who are orchestrated and enabled commission of crimes and provide measure of justice to victims. Now we have an opportunity to advance justice and accountability. Faster we deliver results, sooner it will have effect on the ground. This will send a clear signal against similar criminal acts in the future, and most importantly, will serve justice for victims and survivors, doing this in common responsibility on the mankind. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Prosecutor General Venediktova for her briefing. I would like to commend her for her monumental work in the service of justice. On a personal note, I would like to also recognize her role as the first woman Prosecutor General of Ukraine, working relentlessly to collect the stories of Ukrainians and transform them into facts and evidence before they vanish. The role of civil society is crucial in fact-finding and proof-gathering on the ground, as well as in supporting the process of information and knowledge-sharing among all actors of accountability mechanisms. It is a pleasure for me to now give the floor to Ms. Amal Clooney, representing Clooney Foundation for Justice, who has been doing admirable work to advance justice and accountability the world over. Dear Amal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much to the ambassadors who invited me to address you today. And may I also thank 2 of my fellow speakers, Prosecutor Venediktova and Prosecutor Khan, for the incredible work that you are both doing. It is an honor to be working with the Ukrainian government and for the Ukrainian people as they battle for their freedom. When the government asked me to provide some advice on the ways to pursue justice, I felt, I think, as many lawyers do, not just that there might be an opportunity to help, but that there's actually a duty to do so. Because, Excellencies, Ukraine is today a slaughterhouse, right in the heart of Europe. Putin's aggressive war is so outrageous that even after repeated warnings from the US and Russia's long criminal record, Ukrainians couldn't believe that this could happen. And I still read news headlines not knowing quite how to process them. Could it be that thousands of children are being forcibly deported to Russia? Could it be that teenage girls are being raped in the street in front of their family and their neighbors? Was a building that had the word children on it really bombed? And are civilians today in Mariupol systematically being tortured and starved to death? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. And the world has responded. 141 countries voted in the UN General Assembly to condemn Russia's aggression. The UN created a commission to document crimes. The International Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights have ordered Russia to suspend military operations and safeguard civilian life. 43 countries, as we heard from the prosecutor, have referred Ukraine to the International Criminal Court. This is the biggest grouping of states to ever do that. And at least 13 countries have now started their own war crimes investigations. Russia has been expelled from the Human Rights Council and from the Council of Europe. Countries have sent weapons and ammunition to help the Ukrainian defense. Companies have pulled their businesses out of Russia. And a network of governments has imposed the toughest set of financial sanctions ever seen on a major economy. But the UN was created. This building that we're in was constructed because of a genocide in Europe and to prevent wars of this kind. This council has heard so many speeches with that now hollow refrain, never again. But here we are, faced with evidence of the crime of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and mounting evidence each day of the crime of genocide. How did we get here? I believe we got here by ignoring justice for so long. For too long, we have watched as perpetrators of mass human rights abuses have murdered, tortured, and raped without consequence. From Darfur to Myanmar to Yemen, the perpetrators commit these crimes believing they will get away with it, and they have been right. 10 years ago, I was at the Kremlin with Kofi Annan, whose job it was to mediate a peaceful solution to the Syria conflict. Now, of course, neither Russia nor Syria wanted a peaceful resolution. They had far too much to gain through war. So for 11 years, Syrians have suffered unabating brutality. They've been forced to listen to speeches in rooms like this about victims deserving justice and perpetrators paying the price. They are still waiting. And as I've watched the coverage of the Bucha massacre, it reminds me of the Hula massacre in Syria. This council met in an emergency session to decry the killings, and people thought it would be a turning point for accountability. It wasn't. And now, the same Russian general known as the Butcher, who mounted a brutal attack on civilians in Aleppo, is massacring innocent families in Mariupol. What worries me as I sit here today is that the resolute action we've seen in the first 50 days of this war will turn out to be the high point instead of the starting point of the legal and diplomatic response. That your actions will slowly fade into a predictable pattern, a wealth of investigations and committees and reports, but a dearth of prosecutions and convictions and sentences. Politicians calling for justice but not delivering it. My fear is that you will get busy and distracted, and that each day there'll be a little bit less coverage of the war and people will become a little bit more numb to it, and that Ukraine will end up alone in pursuing the perpetrators of these atrocities. We cannot let that happen. Every state that professes to respect human rights must make sure that it does not become a safe haven for war criminals. Perpetrators should face arrest in every port, and Ukrainians should have access to the billions of dollars they will need to rebuild their state. So let this be a long-awaited turning point. For the sake of Ukraine and the credibility of this institution, let us sustain and escalate the momentum so that a better system of justice is within reach. A Canadian judge once said that it's not what you stand for that's important, but what you stand up for. And standing up for Ukraine means that governments should be taking concrete steps towards justice. Standing up for Ukraine means that states should support the International Criminal Court, clearly and unequivocally. That means the United States should drop unprincipled objections to the court's jurisdiction and offer, along with others, the resources and evidence that is needed to support the prosecutor's work. Standing up for Ukraine means answering Ukraine's call to ensure that those who are responsible for the crime of aggression, who are currently beyond the reach of the ICC, can also be brought to justice before a court of law, and that evidence of this crime is collected and preserved. Standing up for Ukraine means that states should be filing interventions in support of Ukraine's cases against Russia at the International Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. Standing up for Ukraine means making each of your countries a hostile environment for war criminals. This can be done by signing up to a treaty on crimes against humanity that has been more than 70 years in the making, that would allow for national prosecutions of this crime and better evidence sharing between states. And it can be done by expanding national laws to capture more perpetrators of international crimes. In the UK, for example, there have only been 3 prosecutions of international crimes ever. The US has had only 3 cases under their Torture Act and 0 cases charging war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. So I commend the legislation being proposed by Senator Durbin and supported by Senator Graham that would bolster the ability to prosecute these cases in the United States. And I hope that others will follow this lead. Excellencies, standing up for Ukraine also means that the UN General Assembly should make clear that sovereign immunity should not prevent Russian state assets being made available to Ukraine and its people, and that the assets of all those who support this war are at risk. Standing up for Ukraine means that the United Nations should establish a compensation commission so that Ukrainians after this war can have a chance to rebuild their lives. And standing up for Ukraine means extending a welcoming hand to its refugees until it's safe enough for them to go home. Excellencies, when President Zelensky addressed the Security Council, he compared Russia's soldiers to ISIS. Well, I have spent the last 7 years representing victims of ISIS's genocide. Our great success was that this body, the UN Security Council, in a rare show of unity, agreed to set up an investigation. This happened the year that my children were born, and I remember very well coming to the council to watch the vote. It was my first trip as a working mother. But my children are now almost 5. And so far, most of the evidence that has been collected by the UN is in storage, because there is no international court to put ISIS on trial. And when survivors ask me to explain how can this be, I can only say I am ashamed. I am ashamed that there is no system of justice to respond to mass rape and mass slaughter. But I believe that today we have an opportunity to change this, and that we must do, because there is no greater value that the UN could promote than the rule of law. And it is under serious threat when those who commit the most heinous crimes are not held accountable for them. We often speak of what the international community should do to address the horrors of war, but it's not institutions who act. It's individuals with a conscience who are determined enough to make a difference. Peace, like war, must be waged. It doesn't just happen. And justice, too, is something we have to fight for. I'd like to end with a reflection from the very first international case that I worked on. As a young lawyer in The Hague, I was assigned to the trial of Slobodan Milosevic, whose murderous campaign to create a greater Serbia is today being compared to Russia's ambitions over Ukraine. Milosevic, as many of you know, was the first head of state to be put on trial in an international court. No one thought it possible that a former president could be in the dock in The Hague facing genocide charges. But it happened. And eventually, his two henchmen, Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic, followed him there. They are today serving life sentences for their crimes. So sometimes, justice takes time. You may have to wait for someone to be out of office. You may have to wait for some of their underlings to defect. You may have to wait for them to get old or to travel. But if we remain very focused and very resolute, justice may yet be within our reach. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Clooney for such an insightful contribution and the continuous help in prosecuting and holding to account those responsible for war crimes. This is indeed and should be indeed a turning point to stand up for Ukraine, but to also stand up for the international-based order and restore the confidence and credibility of the international law and of multilateralism that has been so severely damaged by Russia's war of choice, but also from what we have not done in the past that perhaps is leading up to what we're seeing today. Nearly every corner in Bucha is now a crime scene, and it felt like death was everywhere. The evidence indicates that Russian forces occupying Bucha showed contempt and disregard for civilian life and the most fundamental principles of the laws of war. These are quotes from the recent report of Human Rights Watch published on April 21st. It is my pleasure to give the floor to the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, Mr. Kenneth Roth, to introduce also our next civil society briefer. Mr. Roth, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Minister Shashka. My thanks to the permanent missions of Albania and France for convening this very important meeting today. I have the brief but pleasurable task of introducing Ida Sawyer, Human Rights Watch's director of our Conflict and Crisis Division. Ida is one of those who has been overseeing the teams that Human Rights Watch has had in Ukraine throughout the conflict. And we have been documenting and analyzing apparent war crimes, both to aid the very important justice effort that has been the focus today, but also to provide as close as possible real-time information to the international community in order to put pressure on the parties to refrain from atrocities, and perhaps most important, to the people of Ukraine and of Russia, so that they are aware of crimes being committed in their names and can put pressure on the relevant authorities to stop. Ida is speaking to us from Kiev, where she is involved in these investigations, and it's my pleasure to turn the microphone over to her.
Thank you, Ken. Your Excellency, Minister Jashka, dear distinguished guests and fellow briefers, thank you to the permanent missions of Albania and France for convening this important meeting. Today, Human Rights Watch has the microphone, but we acknowledge the Ukrainian and Russian human rights defenders who have been for many years working on the front lines, documenting violations and pressing for credible justice. We stand in solidarity with them during this challenging time. The violations of human rights and international humanitarian law by Russian forces in this conflict are grave and severe. Since 2014, we have documented a litany of apparent war crimes that runs too long to mention here. Over the past 2 months, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, my colleagues and I have documented the killing of civilians and damage to homes, schools, and hospitals in Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Mykolaiv, and elsewhere from apparently indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks. In the town of Bucha and other areas that Russian forces held, we found extensive evidence of summary executions, enforced disappearances, torture, sexual violence, and arbitrary detentions, all of which could constitute war crimes and potentially crimes against humanity. In Mariupol, tens of thousands of civilians have been trapped as their city was turned to rubble with little to no food, water, medicine, heating, or means of communication, and no safe way to escape. Many have apparently been forcibly transported to Russia. We urge Russia to let all civilians who wish to flee the city to areas controlled by Ukraine to be allowed to do so safely. We ask authorities to pay special attention to those often disproportionately affected in conflicts: children, older people, and people with disabilities. The environmental and health impacts will also be intense and long-term. The laws of war apply to all parties to the conflict, and we welcome Ukraine's public commitment to adhere to those norms. One concern is Ukraine's treatment of prisoners of war, and we note credible reports of abuse that should be investigated. Another is Ukraine's reported use of cluster munitions, which, if accurate, should immediately stop and personnel responsible for using these weapons held to account. In all of our research, what we hear again and again is that the victims of these violations want justice. The pattern of abuse we are seeing in Ukraine is consistent with well-documented grave crimes by Russian forces in other places, such as Syria. The lack of accountability for those violations has regrettably opened the door for what is occurring today. Against that background, we welcome the unprecedented response by so many governments to encourage a range of accountability tools so that serious crimes get punished. We note the UN Human Rights Council's swift action to establish a commission of inquiry, government's strong support of an international criminal court investigation, and the decision by judicial authorities in several countries to pursue their own criminal investigations under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Many governments have offered Ukraine assistance to bolster its judicial capacity. Meanwhile, domestic and international civil society groups have been vigorously documenting violations as they occur. Today, we would like to stress some points to ensure that these efforts lead to positive outcomes for accountability, both for this conflict and for others. Our research has shown that fair and effective justice is achievable with the right combination of appropriate laws, adequate resources and expertise, institutional commitments, effective cooperation, and above all, political will. Fair and effective investigations and prosecutions at the national level will be essential to achieve broad-based accountability. However, cases involving grave crimes are complex to investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate, all the more so in the midst of an armed conflict. Increased capacity and resources will therefore be needed to effectively address the large scale of violations being committed. Ukrainian authorities can build on existing domestic experience through collaboration with those in the international community who offer evidentiary, technical, and operational support to facilitate the investigation and prosecution of international crimes. Doing so will benefit efforts to preserve evidence and safeguard crime scenes, and could help ensure a robust framework for victim support and witness protection. We also join our Ukrainian civil society colleagues in calling on Ukraine to ratify the Rome Statute, which will allow Ukraine to exercise full rights of membership to the Assembly of States Parties, the ICC's governing body. In addition to ratification, we urge Ukraine to fully align its national legislation with the Rome Statute and international law. A bill adopted by Ukraine's parliament in May 2021 that could help authorities prosecute serious crimes domestically has yet to be signed into law. To ensure accountability for serious crimes in Ukraine, a multi-tiered, cross-cutting approach will be needed, which includes a range of actors at the international level: the ICC, national courts, and various documentation efforts. We urge international actors involved in these efforts to focus on 5 key priorities. First, and as many have underlined, it is imperative to ensure coordination among the different accountability actors with an overarching strategy. This includes common standards for the collection, preservation, and archiving of evidence. Second, impartial investigations and prosecutions are essential. At stake is keeping justice above politics for this conflict and beyond. Third, the international community should ensure that justice is not sidelined in any peace negotiations and that compromise on justice is rejected. Experience shows that decisions to forego accountability can prove costly in the long term. Fourth, authorities should work with civil society to inform judicial processes. Beyond documentation work, civil society can facilitate access to information and outreach to victims and affected communities. Lastly, we hope that the international community will use this moment to strengthen the cause of justice worldwide. We welcome the commitment to accountability for crimes in Ukraine and would like to see this principled support replicated in other conflicts where civilians suffer, such as in Yemen, Ethiopia, and Palestine. To do otherwise would undermine the international justice system as a whole. Thank you for this invitation and your attention.
I thank Director Sawyer for her striking account. Let me express once again my appreciation for the heroic work that Human Rights Watch and other civil society organizations are doing to document these crimes, to raise awareness about them, and support the alignment of national legislation with international law necessary to build the legal framework for an effective domestic investigation and prosecution of international crimes. I would now like the opportunity to make some brief remarks in the national capacity as the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania. Let me once again thank all of our briefers for the information that they shared with us. It is painful, it is very painful to hear, but it is important that the whole world hears what is happening in Ukraine, not just from politicians or individual countries, but from voices of authority on the issue of human rights, from voices that people all over the world know and accept and value as voices that speak the truth in defense of human rights and in the cause for peace and justice. It is for this reason that I'm very grateful to the High Commissioner for Human Rights for her brief. It is for this reason that I'm very grateful to the ICC Prosecutor Khan, as well as I'm so grateful from the heart to Ms. Amal Clooney and Ms. Ida Sawyer for their contributions to this session. But let me also give a very special thanks to the Prosecutor General of Ukraine for her heroic work under extraordinarily difficult conditions by opening cases and documenting more than 8,000 cases of crimes committed by the Russian army during its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. I come from the Western Balkans, a region that until February 24th of 2022 had the distinction of having been the theater of the last war in Europe. The scenes of bloodshed and of destruction we see coming from Ukraine hit home very differently from someone for whom war and war crimes are not things that you read about in history books, but are memories from but a few decades ago. In 1999, my country sheltered 500,000 Kosovars fleeing the brutal war and campaigns of ethnic cleansing. The single most vivid memory I have from the time is of the sense of powerlessness to stop what was happening, and the conviction, the almost violent conviction that we all felt, that whoever was committing those horrible crimes had to pay, had to be held accountable. It stayed with me, and it awoke again in me and in many, many people in Albania and all over the world when the terrible images started coming out of Ukraine, this terrible feeling of pain and rage that such horrible crimes were being committed right before our eyes against innocent people in a country that had done nothing to provoke the attack against it. It is, of course, not just because of the Western Balkans' recent history that Albania became one of the 43 countries that referred the situation in Ukraine to the Prosecutor General of the ICC just a few days after the beginning of the conflict. And it is not just because of the painful memories of the 1990s that Albania became one of the founders of the Group of Friends for Accountability. We did it because we believe that the world has an obligation to do its best to offer justice to the Ukrainian people. We did it because despite the painful repetitions of such tragic situations in our recent history, the world still does not have a better, more effective way to ensure that such crimes do not happen again except for accountability. But there is another reason why we did it, which is especially poignant in the case of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, because Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a country that is supposed to be one of the guardians of the international rules-based system and is therefore endowed with veto power, but has suddenly gone rogue. A supposed guardian of the system has embarked on a war of choice against a neighbor, committing unimaginable crimes in the process. Why? Not because it was attacked, not because it was threatened, but because it chose to. It has not stopped, even when the General Assembly of this organization overwhelmingly condemned its war and told it to stop. What kind of world would we be living in if we do not unite in the face of this? What kind of message would we be sending to every aspiring dictator and every regime who, for reasons of choice, decides it is not happy with its borders, its geopolitical space or resources? It is also for this reason that Russia must be held to account. And this is something we owe to the Ukrainian people too, who in this war are fighting not just for their land and for their country, but also for us, for our peace and security and stability, and for the future of us all. Accountability is about protecting the foundations of our system, the principles of the UN Charter, our common values and our shared responsibility. We could not prevent this conflict, but we must not fail to hold accountable all those responsible. I would like to give the floor to Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, to Ms. Emine Japarova, who has kindly joined us today in the absence of Minister Kuleba, who, for reasons that we all understand, made it impossible to participate. Ms. Japarova, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear friends, excellencies, colleagues and partners, I would like to first of all thank the Permanent Mission of Albania and France for arranging this meeting and for all of the briefers for your kind words of support, for your readiness to act, because this is something that we need to keep on fighting. And believe me, I will take everything back to Kiev, the energy of support. This is what we need. This is our fuel. I'm addressing you today on behalf of my home country, Ukraine, and as a representative of two nations, Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians, that suffered Moscow-made genocide in 20th century. These are Holodomor, which is a man-made hunger and famine, and deportation, we call it Sürgün in Crimean Tatar language, exile of all of the Crimean Tatars from their land. And unfortunately, today we suffer the consequences of war and occupation in the 21st century. The history of my country teaches us all one very simple lesson. If crimes are not punished and criminals are not brought to accountability, you can expect bigger crimes and atrocities. When I was a child, my grandmothers used to tell me the tragic story of deportation. Every single family of the Crimean Tatar nation has survived it. When back in 1944, women, children, and seniors were put in the cattle shed wagons and taken to Central Asian countries, while men were fighting within the Soviet army against fascism during the Second World War. Moscow back then cynically justified its crime that killed almost half of all Crimean Tatars by fake and false allegations of collaboration with Nazi Germany, just like Russia is doing today, hiding its crime of war behind fakes and manipulations. Many years after, I, already as a mother, had to explain my daughters why we are not able to live in Crimea anymore, in my homeland, after the occupation of 2014, when after Russia invaded the peninsula, they started oppressing Crimean Tatars immediately for their pro-Ukrainian stand. The evil we all did not stop 8 years ago became bigger. The beast wants more land, more blood, and more lives. And I never ever thought that my daughters would probably have to explain their children the experience that they have with the war and occupation. And this is really horrible. My thoughts when I speak here today are with Yelizaveta and Sonia. These are the two angels, small actors of Mariupol theater, killed by Russian bombs, as well as with 3-month-old Kira and her mother, killed by Russian missile in Odessa right on the eve of Easter. The death of children is always an unbearable pain. As I'm telling you this, Russian armed forces continue to shell Ukrainian cities intensively. They use aerial bombs, heavy artillery, missiles. The city of Mariupol has turned into dust. Thousands of civilians remain in blockade without water, electricity, communication, and basic things that all people need. Mariupol, Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, these are the cities already well known throughout the world. And what you can see there today, and for example, Mr. Karimhan has already attended the cities, this is not the Netflix decoration of horror movies. This is the reality that I and many of my compatriots live in. Ukrainian law enforcement bodies revealed and launched investigation into almost 8,000 war crimes committed by Russian army. New mass graves and burials are being found almost every day. The final number of Russian war crimes in Ukraine will be much higher, especially taking into account how the Russian army behaves itself. Killing, tortures, rapes, robbing and destroying. They even rob socks and pants and toilet bowls and the dog houses. We Ukrainians fight for rule-based world and order, and we truly believe in international law as a fundamental principle and instrument to bring all of the criminals to accountability. That's why we initiated a case in the ICJ against Russia on the alleged genocide. We filed all necessary documents just in 2 days after the beginning of the full-fledged invasion. ICJ ordered Russia to immediately suspend military operations commenced on 24th of February. But in already a very traditional manner, Russia ignored it, as it did it before. But the floor to act is not only by Russia. Each and every signatory of the UN Charter should demand that it is being respected, that the binding order are to be implemented. Russia must be accountable for its crime as a state, but we all know, as Ms. Amal Clooney said, that every crime has also a person who commits it. The one who raped a girl, kicking out her teeth, who killed a man riding a bicycle, who fusilladed a queue of people waiting for bread, who shot humanitarian convoys, maternity hospitals, ambulances, cars. These people have names and faces, and they are to be brought to criminal liability. We appreciate the work done by our Prosecutor General Office and the ICC and Mr. Karimhan and everyone who supports us. Ukraine has also endorsed the proposal of the leading experts in the sphere of international criminal law to create a special criminal tribunal for the punishment of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. I believe that the special criminal tribunal will complement the work of the ICC in prosecuting persons responsible for their crimes and the preparation of this aggression, its execution, initiation, and so on. I call on you, distinguished colleagues, using this opportunity to consider thoroughly creation of such a new mechanism and support it. Even when Putin will be defeated, and I'm sure he will quite soon, the business as usual with Russia could not be restored without holding accountable of all perpetrators. The Ukrainian leadership will take every possible effort to bring these people to justice. Despite everything, despite hardships of war, the governmental institutions have been fully remaining operational, and we are very proud of our people who demonstrate amazing bravery. We are proud of our army and even our president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who has become a symbol of dignity and human spirit. Slava Ukraini! Glory to Ukraine!
I thank you, dear Emine, for your statement. It is heartbreaking to see what your people are going through, but it's also very inspiring to see their heroic resistance and their bravery, as you said. I'd like now to pass the floor to the co-organizer of this event, the representative of France, for her remarks. Dear Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Chair. And I would like to thank all the briefers today for their very powerful statements. I commend the remarkable work of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, of Michelle Bachelet and her teams, of the ICC, and of the United Nations agencies on the ground as war is still raging in Ukraine. I also pay tribute to the work done by the civil society to document crimes committed in Ukraine. We also commend the swift operationalization by the OHCHR of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. For more than 2 months now, Russia has been killing civilians, including women, children, the elderly, humanitarian and medical workers, and journalists. The number of civilian casualties that the High Commissioner has presented is absolutely horrific. The images of the atrocities committed in Bucha and other areas previously occupied by the Russian forces are unbearable. These acts may amount to war crimes, as our briefers have underlined. France is appalled by the killing and maiming of children, as well as attacks on schools and on hospitals. And France commends UNFPA and all actors on the ground providing services to survivors of sexual violence. France is firmly committed to working with Ukraine, its international partners, as well as international jurisdiction and mechanism to prevent impunity for these intolerable acts. So we welcome the report prepared by independent experts of the OSCE Moscow mechanism, which points out to the existence of very clear patterns of international human rights violation by the Russian forces in their conduct of hostilities. The report's conclusion will inform the investigations that are underway. Upon referral of 43 states, including France, the ICC prosecutor has opened an investigation into the situation in Ukraine, and we welcome the swift deployment of an ICC investigation team on the ground in Ukraine. And we have sent 2 judges and 10 investigators and made a financial contribution of €500,000 to support concretely this team, in addition to the annual funding we provide for the ICC. So following the discovery of mass atrocities in the areas previously occupied by Russian forces, in the city of Bucha in particular, France has deployed a technical team to provide expertise in identification of evidence gathering. Those forensic scientists and crime scene experts are supporting Ukrainian and ICC teams on the ground. Mrs. Chair, the ICC is a pillar of the international rule-based order. It needs support. We call on all states to ratify the Rome Statute. Mrs. Chair, we call on Russia to respect the order of the ICJ and stop its war of aggression against Ukraine. The priority remains an immediate cessation of hostilities, a withdrawal of all Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine, and the full respect of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The protection of civilians is an absolute imperative, in particular in the besieged Mariupol, and humanitarian access must be guaranteed. Mrs. Chair, France will continue to support Ukraine, the Ukrainians, and all efforts to ensure the effective investigation and prosecution of all those responsible for atrocities in Ukraine, and I can assure you those crimes won't go unpunished. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for her statements, as well as for the very close and excellent cooperation in the organization of this meeting. I would like now to open the floor for the other members of the Security Council, and the first on my list is the US delegation, represented by Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, Dr. Beth van der Schaak. Dr. van der Schaak, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to France and Albania for convening us today, and for all the keynote speakers. Your work is really critical, and we're deeply grateful for all that you do in this matter. The United States is also quite pleased to co-sponsor this event this afternoon. It has now been 2 months since Moscow launched its latest assault and further aggression on Ukraine. As Secretary General Guterres confirmed when the war began, Russia's war against Ukraine is unacceptable. It is a manifest violation of the UN Charter. Russia has failed in its objective of capturing Kyiv, and it has failed in its objective of subjugating Ukraine. But we have all still seen the Kremlin inflict massive brutality across the country. And the United States has assessed that Russia's forces are committing war crimes in Ukraine. This assessment is based upon a careful and rigorous review of public sources and also intelligence sources. At first, this violence took the form of what appeared to be deliberate and indiscriminate attacks against civilians and elements of the civilian infrastructure. Later, however, when brave journalists and human rights defenders and other elements and other actors got access to areas following Russia's retreat, we saw violence of a different order. This was interpersonal violence. Credible reports of individuals killed execution style with their hands bound, bodies showing signs of torture, horrific accounts of sexual violence against women and girls. We now have credible information that a Russian military unit operating in the vicinity of Donetsk executed Ukrainians who were attempting to surrender rather than take them into custody. If true, this would be a violation of a core principles of the laws of war, the prohibition against the summary execution of civilians and of combatants who are hors de combat by virtue of surrender, injury, or other forms of incapacitation. These images and reports suggest that atrocities are not the result of rogue units or individuals. They rather reveal a deeply disturbing pattern of systematic abuse across all areas where Russia's forces are engaged. Let us be clear, those who unleashed, perpetrated, and ordered these crimes must be held to account, and the evidence of this criminality is mounting daily. Our simple message to Russia's military and political leadership and to the rank and file is this: the world is watching, and you will be held accountable. The United States is supporting a range of international investigations into atrocities in Ukraine. This includes those conducted by the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The United States welcomes the opening of the investigation by the ICC into atrocity crimes committed in Ukraine, and we intend to engage with all stakeholders to achieve our common objectives in ensuring justice. With many European partners, the United States is also supporting the Ukrainian national authorities, and specifically the war crimes units of the Office of the Prosecutor General, as they investigate and prepare to prosecute war crimes cases in Ukrainian courts. We are funding a multinational team of experts and other war crimes prosecutors deployed to the region. This interdisciplinary team is providing advice and support to Ukraine's Prosecutor General to collect, preserve, and analyze evidence of atrocities with a view towards achieving criminal accountability. These individuals bring years of experience at the International War Crimes Tribunals in the investigation and prosecution of international crimes, and they will be supporting their Ukrainian counterparts as they build their own case files. And we welcome other states to join in this effort. We also stand ready to support national courts around the world as in the event that they seek to establish jurisdiction over individuals accused of committing international crimes. And of course, we welcome and will support proceedings before the International Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, which are both adjudicating state responsibility. We will also continue to assist with documentation efforts. We helped to establish the Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry, ensuring that it had a strong mandate to investigate, document, and analyze violations of international humanitarian law and human rights, share that information with appropriate judicial bodies, and to identify the individuals and entities who are responsible. We also joined 44 OSCE participating states in invoking the Moscow Mechanism fact-finding mission. The experts' report, released on April 13th, has provided a meticulous and compelling account of Russia's violations and abuses within Ukraine. It also cites evidence of the direct targeting of civilians, attacks on medical facilities, rape, executions, looting, and forced deportations of citizens to Russia. All of the information collected by these experts will be made available to the relevant accountability mechanisms, as well as any courts that may have jurisdiction now or in the future may exercise that jurisdiction. And the regular updates from the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission on the ground in Ukraine have greatly informed our understanding of the situation. And we commend the mission in continuing to document civilian casualties and damage to civilian objects. As the High Commissioner for Human Rights herself acknowledged, the actual number of casualties is much higher than what appears in published reports. We will no doubt learn more as the horrors inflicted in areas of intense fighting, such as Mariupol, come to light. Finally, as part of our effort to advance accountability in Ukraine, the United States has released information on the immediate priorities of the European Democratic Resilience Initiative. Announced by President Biden during his visit to Brussels in March, this initiative will provide up to $320 million in new funding to support societal resilience and to defend human rights, including through supporting accountability-related projects. Together, each and every one of these institutions and mechanisms make up a system interlinked of international justice. At the same time, and on other fronts, the United States and other states have been working together to implement sanctions on Russia's leadership, as well as private individuals and entities, in order to strengthen Ukraine's hand, starve Russia of the resources it has been using to prosecute this unprovoked war of aggression, and encourage individuals subject to sanction to dramatically change course. And finally, in close cooperation with our allies and partners, the United States has taken action through the General Assembly 3 times, most recently to overwhelmingly vote to oust Russia from the Human Rights Council. We now all occupy a unique historical moment when there is a global consensus that the conduct of the Russian state is intolerable and those in command and control must not go unpunished for unleashing such violence and brutality and for violating international peace and security. At this critical moment, we must continue to coordinate international and multilateral lines of effort to advance the interlocking imperatives of justice and accountability, to preserve the sanctions of international norms, to hold accountable those responsible, and to respond to the victims' legitimate demands and desires for justice. We already have regional and international accountability institutions in place. It is now up to us to remain coordinated and single-minded in our efforts. Russia will predictably veto any effort by the Council to hold it accountable for these atrocities, but as Ambassador Thomas Greenfield recently said in the Council, Russia cannot veto accountability. In closing, I know that the vast majority of members today believe that the people of Ukraine should be able to live their lives without having the fear of their homes being destroyed by a Russian shell or of being shot with their hands tied behind their back and left dying on the street. Effective accountability measures for those who are ordering and committing atrocities will make clear that those who engage in brutality will not enjoy impunity. Together with Ukraine and our allies and partners, we are united in our resolve to bring perpetrators to justice. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank Dr. Schack for her strong statement and intervention. I now give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And may I start by thanking Albania, France and Ukraine for convening today's ARIA Formula meeting, and also extending thanks to all of our briefers. In particular, I want to convey the UK's solidarity and support to Deputy Foreign Minister Japarova, and through her to the Ukrainian government and people. Russia's attacks on civilians in Ukraine constitute war crimes. The UK is determined that those responsible be held accountable. I'd like to make 3 points about international coordination, evidence collection, and sexual violence. First, the UK is supporting international efforts to see justice delivered. We're supporting the International Criminal Court's work and will provide £1 million of additional funding. The UK also supports the Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry, the OSCE, Council of Europe, and European Court of Human Rights in their work to ensure all allegations of atrocity crimes are thoroughly investigated. But as Ida Sawyer eloquently reminded us, we must ensure that these efforts are coordinated and complementary. Second, the evidence that's collected must be collected urgently and properly to ensure it meets the appropriate standard for future prosecutions. The UK has appointed leading war crimes lawyer, Sir Howard Morrison, to support the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's own investigations. And the Metropolitan Police have set up an online reporting tool for witnesses, including refugees, to submit their evidence. Third, we must ensure accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. This is an issue on which the UK has partnered especially closely with Prosecutor Khan and Ms. Clooney, and we're grateful for your dedication and commitment. The Foreign Secretary has launched a £10 million civil society fund to support organisations in Ukraine, including those helping survivors of sexual violence. And the Murad Code, launched earlier this month, provides important guidelines for interviewing survivors of sexual violence, and we welcome that it will be applied with respect to Ukraine. As we've heard, every day, more deeply disturbing reports of sexual violence emerge. Mass graves, where women were raped before being killed. Bodies so disfigured they would be impossible to identify. The perpetrators of these horrors and crimes, those who have directed them and those who have carried them out, the mass executions, rapes, and mutilations of innocent men and women, will face justice. It is our duty to the victims and survivors, and, as Prosecutor Khan said, to humanity. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I give the floor to the representative of Ireland. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks to Albania and France also for organising today's discussion. We're really proud to be a co-sponsor of such an important exchange. I'd like to thank all our briefers. Their presentations were powerful, but they were also stark at times, appropriately so. Madam Chair, it said that all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men, I would argue good women, to say nothing. In the face of Russia's unlawful and unjustifiable further invasion of Ukraine, the members of this House of the United Nations cannot afford to say nothing. We cannot afford to stay quiet, and that's why many of us are stepping in where the Security Council has failed, and we are speaking out forcefully. However, as the true horror of the atrocities allegedly committed in Ukraine come to light, disapprobation is simply not enough. As Irish Minister Simon Coveney told the Security Council last week, there are rules even in war. And when those rules are broken, there must be accountability. That is why timely, credible investigations are so vital. It is why evidence must be rigorously documented. It is why witnesses, victims, and survivors must be supported. Madam Chair, we contend that the scope for impunity is diminishing. In contrast to 20 years ago, the International Criminal Court now stands as the first permanent international court with the power to prosecute atrocity crimes, including those happening in Ukraine. Ireland joined over 40 states to refer the situation in Ukraine to the ICC, recognising the pressure this investigation will place on the court. We are also committing additional funding to assist in the investigation of all situations before the ICC. We welcome the announcement by the Office of the Prosecutor that it will participate in the joint investigation team on alleged core international crimes committed in Ukraine. That will help to ensure cooperation, coordination and collective action between the ICC and national authorities, including in Ukraine. And just today, we have heard a powerful statement from the Prosecutor General of Ukraine speaking to the scale of her office's investigation of Russian war crimes. However, notwithstanding these efforts towards accountability, notwithstanding the provisional measures indicated by the International Court of Justice, Russia's aggression continues unabated. Russia has not only ignored international humanitarian law, but in the words of the High Commissioner, it has tossed it aside. From the reporting of the OSCE Moscow Mechanism's mission of experts, we can now see clear patterns of violations of international humanitarian law by Russia. Evidence of such violations continues to mount, from the destruction of Mariupol hospital by Russian airstrikes to indiscriminate attacks on Kramatorsk train station. We have seen mass graves being excavated in Bucha and elsewhere. We have heard harrowing reports of conflict-related sexual violence, which we also must stress can constitute a war crime. There can be no impunity for such abuse. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission has recorded over 5,000 civilian casualties in Ukraine, an appalling figure which we know doesn't reflect yet those casualties in areas of such intense fighting, such as Mariupol, Izium, and Popasna, where reports of abominable summary executions of civilians are emerging. Madam Chair, Ireland is fully committed to accountability for these heinous actions and for those which have yet to be uncovered. Moving ahead, as Ida Sawyer pointed out earlier, cooperation and coordination of all our accountability efforts will be key. For this reason, we want to acknowledge today the efforts here by the group of Friends on Accountability in Ukraine to coordinate and share information on existing and emerging accountability initiatives. We welcome the work by Eurojust and the EU Advisory Mission to ensure that domestic and international investigations are supported. And Mr. Moses' statement today that the Commission will be reaching out to the ICC prosecutor is also very important. As I conclude, Madam Chair, I would like to say a word directly to Ukrainian women and men who today must be harbouring doubts that justice will ever be delivered. I deeply regret that the Security Council has failed. We have failed in our collective duty to prevent conflict and maintain peace in Ukraine. We all know why. However, even as this unjustified war continues, there are those amongst us who will not stop trying. There are those who will continue to demand justice for the crimes committed. I want to recall the words of the great Nelson Mandela, who remarked, "It always seems impossible until it's done." From Rwanda to Cambodia, Bosnia to Sierra Leone, accountability for such crimes once may have seemed impossible until it was done. Rest assured that Ireland will work tirelessly to ensure you, the women and men of Ukraine, that you too obtain justice. The perpetrators of these heinous crimes will be held to account. We owe you nothing less. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of Ireland and give the floor to the representative of UAE.
Madam Chair, I thank the permanent missions of Albania and France for organizing this ARIA Formula meeting, as well as all the panelists for their participation and contributions. The UAE is deeply concerned by the continued fighting in Ukraine and the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation on the ground. This conflict has again laid bare the terrible human costs of war, and those costs are largely borne by millions of civilians, in particular women and children. But as we know, its repercussions are increasingly felt beyond the borders of Ukraine. We, along with the rest of the international community, have been shocked by the reports and images that we have seen coming out of Ukraine over the past weeks, including of alleged targeting and summary executions of civilians, conflict-related sexual violence, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. The UAE reiterates its call on all parties to uphold international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and we strongly condemn all atrocities and violations of these laws in all their forms. Accountability is not optional, it is essential. Achieving justice for victims and survivors, effectively fighting impunity, and deterring future atrocities requires properly instituted mechanisms and processes. Establishing the facts and circumstances in an impartial manner and beyond any doubt or dispute is both fundamental and difficult, as we have seen in other cases. Therefore, it is critical to ensure the proper investigation of alleged crimes, focusing on fact-finding and data collection. We underline that the primary responsibility for accountability lies at the national level, and appropriate authorities should be given the space needed to fulfill that responsibility. We encourage support for domestic rule of law institutions and investigative processes, and note the importance of providing such support in cooperation with national officials. As a member of the Human Rights Council, the UAE voted in favor of Resolution 49/1, establishing the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine with a mandate that includes investigating all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law, as well as documenting and verifying relevant information and evidence. We know that investigative mechanisms are complex and can take considerable time to deliver on their mandate. However, effective accountability demands it. In the meantime, we must focus on saving lives and reducing suffering by achieving an immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine and finding a diplomatic resolution to this conflict. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of UAE and give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Excellency and Minister. Let me also thank the permanent missions of Albania, France, and Ukraine for organizing this important discussion. I acknowledge the presence of the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Madam Charapova, and I thank the briefers for their shared perspectives. Chairperson, at the heart of today's meeting is the pressing need to stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine who are bearing the brunt of the failure of the global multilateral order to keep the world safe from the scourge of war. This discussion is therefore an opportunity to reaffirm our resolve to keep alive the purposes of the United Nations, particularly as set out under Article 1 of the United Nations Charter. Kenya maintains that if multilateralism is to deliver sustained peace to all, then the most powerful states must adhere to international law and respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries in all regions at all times. Thus, the continuing breach of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity by the Russian Federation cannot be justified by any reason. We've heard reports of loss of thousands of lives and continuing suffering of millions in and out of Ukraine because of this war. We've also heard reports of massive damage and destruction of civilian infrastructure in violation of international law and international humanitarian law. Therefore, as it should be in any case of violation of international law, the call for investigations, for accountability for violations that may be unfolding in Ukraine is justified as part of the delivery of justice for the people of Ukraine. And considering that ensuring accountability is largely a legal undertaking, we propose that the following elements be taken into consideration. One, there has to be a united call for accountability and coherence among the relevant UN agencies and bodies in line with Article 1.4 of the UN Charter. Second, the independence of investigations must be safeguarded at all times, particularly against undue politicization to ensure credibility and objectivity. And third, there will be need for strong support for Ukrainian national investigative and judicial mechanisms, especially in securing possible crime scenes, preservation of evidence, and protection of witnesses. Having said this, Chair, it is our considered view that accountability should also be pursued within the broader and more comprehensive context of conflict resolution. It is therefore critical not to lose focus on the need to stop the war through the prioritized and sequenced activities that entail, among others, cessation of hostilities, achieving a permanent ceasefire, and initiating a viable political process for conflict resolution, identifying and addressing the root causes in order to work towards sustainable outcomes for the peace process, addressing the consequences of conflict, including gross human rights abuses and international crimes, and finally, ensuring meaningful participation of all parties involved and essential stakeholders, including women and youth. To conclude, I reaffirm Kenya's solidarity with the people of Ukraine and our support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya and give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For their updates on the topic of today's meeting. We continue to remain deeply concerned at the worsening situation in Ukraine and reiterate call for immediate cessation of violence and end to hostilities. We believe that no solution can be arrived at by shedding blood and at the cost of innocent lives. We have emphasized right from the beginning of the conflict the need to pursue the path of diplomacy and dialogue. We have unequivocally condemned the reported killings in Busha and reiterate our support for the call for an independent investigation. We welcome UN Secretary General's ongoing visit in the region, including to Moscow and Kyiv, and have taken positive note of his discussions with the parties on humanitarian corridors in Ukraine, especially in Mariupol. India has been at the forefront of protecting human rights from its inception, including in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We firmly believe that all decisions should be taken respecting due process, as all our democratic polity and structures enjoin us to do. This applies to the international organizations as well, including the United Nations. Let me also place on record that India is not a party to the Rome Statute. We continue to emphasize to all member states of the UN that the global order is anchored on international law, UN Charter, and respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of state. It is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early solution to the conflict in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India and give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and many thanks to Albania and France for convening this meeting. We join others as well in thanking today's briefers for clearly underlining the need for accountability for atrocities committed in Ukraine, and for shedding light on the different mechanisms and initiatives being undertaken to ensure this. The UN Charter applies to all nations, including Russia. Yet there is no doubt that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. And Norway is appalled by Russia's methods of warfare. Numerous credible reports have described it in horrible detail, the relentless attacks against civilians. These atrocities shock the very consciousness and conscience of humanity. Non-combatants, including women, children, and refugees, have become victims, and vital civilian infrastructure leveled in blatant violations of international law. It is imperative that we hold all perpetrators to account through both credible national and international criminal justice mechanisms. Accountability is key, both to ensure that the victims and to deter and prevent future violations. Appropriate mechanisms are therefore necessary to gather evidence and to adjudicate. Those committing atrocities must know that their actions will never be forgotten. War crimes will be investigated, and individuals at all levels held to account for their actions. Dear colleagues, we are grateful for today's briefing by the prosecutor of the ICC and are pleased that this office has initiated investigations of possible war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine. Norway remains a strong supporter of the ICC and was among the unprecedented number of 43 states referring the situation in Ukraine to the courts. There can be no doubt that the ICC's mission remains as crucial as ever, both in the context of Ukraine and globally. Norway underscores also the importance of the ruling of the International Court of Justice last month, which clearly and unequivocally ordered Russia to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. Russia's disregard of this significant ruling, which it is obliged to heed, is deplorable. Norway also welcomes the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine by the Human Rights Council, which is mandated to investigate violations and abuses on human rights and violations of international humanitarian law in the context of Ukraine. We expect that the Commission will identify individuals and entities responsible for violations and contribute to holding them to account. Madam Chair, we have a common interest in ensuring that the perpetrators of international crimes do not escape with impunity. Therefore, the adoption of the General Assembly of the resolution Aggression against Ukraine, calling all parties to strictly respect the relevant provisions of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, send an important signal from the international community. And Norway commends the founders of the Group of Friends for Accountability in Ukraine for creating a valuable platform to engage and promote synergies between the various measures that are being initiated at national, regional, and international level to ensure accountability in Ukraine. Dear friends and colleagues, to end, let me reiterate, accountability is essential. Violations of international law cannot go unchallenged. International law is not optional. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of Norway and give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the outset, Brazil would like to thank Albania and France for organizing this meeting. We would also like to thank the briefers for their contribution to this debate. Brazil would like to draw attention to the fact that in order to ensure an order based on international law, a fundamental task must be taken up to defend its integrity at all times and in all situations. International law must prevail, especially when international crimes and internationally wrongful acts are committed by individuals and states. This is why the rules of the criminal accountability and international responsibility must lie at the epicenter of any legal regime. Over the years, the international community has built a solid legal system to hold individuals accountable for their crimes, the Rome Statute regime. International criminal justice is a solution only when states with jurisdiction are unwilling or unable to act. Complementarity is one of the cornerstones of the Rome Statute regime. Such principle shows that it's imperative to build a culture of accountability at the national level with strong judicial institutions that are able to fight impunity. Cooperation is also one of the key tools in ensuring successful outcomes by the International Criminal Court. As a founder of the ICC, Brazil supports its work to promote accountability at the international level for perpetrators, as well as reparations for the victims. Brazil also highlights the value of having a permanent treaty-based tribunal. Advancing the universality of the Rome Statute would be a fundamental contribution to ensuring accountability in the international community. We call on all states to ratify the Rome Statute and to fully cooperate with the ICC. If the universality of the Rome Statute is achieved, especially amongst the permanent members of the Security Council, there would be a more fertile ground for justice and stability in the international legal system. Another point we would like to raise is the gap between the growing workload of the ICC and the resources available to it in its regular budget. This gap is widened by the current situation in which only states parties cover the cost of Security Council referrals. We hope this can be solved in a fair and sustainable manner. We also hope that the recent call for voluntary contributions will not lead to selectivity in the work of the court. All victims should be prioritized equally. The ICC was established to allow for the promotion of international criminal justice in a non-selective manner. States must refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the UN Charter. Unfortunately, the international community has witnessed several attempts and violations of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter over the past decades and still today. This is a line that should never be crossed. If crossed, norms related to international accountability and responsibility must prevail. To conclude, I would like to recall that Brazil voted in favor of the Human Rights Council resolution that created an independent commission of inquiry on Ukraine to assess and review the facts on the ground. We trust that this mechanism will establish the facts and circumstances that may amount to violations of international law in Ukraine. The proper documentation of alleged crimes is the first step in ensuring individual criminal accountability, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil and give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And given the long list of speakers, I'll try to be brief. Madam Chair, Excellencies, I'll begin, as everyone else, thanking Albania and France for convening this meeting, and also in thanking all the panelists for their remarks. As we have heard, reports on the situation in Ukraine suggest that we are facing great breaches of international human rights and international humanitarian law, and the images of possible mass graves in Mariupol are simply alarming. As a result of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, Mexico supported as well the establishment of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry by the Human Rights Council, as well as the judicial processes both in the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, in order to adjudicate, prosecute, and punish those responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, from the angles both of individual and state responsibility. And since mention has been made on the importance to take action rather than just to say words, I also want to recall that together with France, we brought together to the General Assembly a resolution on the humanitarian access in Ukraine, which was adopted again with an overwhelming majority. In this context also, I would also wish to reiterate the importance of the French-Mexican initiative on the voluntary restraint of the veto in cases of mass atrocities, which is now supported by 105 states. This number may sound very high, but it is in these types of situations that we recognize that this is the moment in which we should reassess and reconsider the adherence to this important initiative, and we invite those states that have not yet done so to reconsider joining and to use this high time to sign as well. In order to promote and ensure accountability at the national and international levels, it is also of the utmost importance to launch this fall a process to negotiate and adopt a convention to prevent and punish crimes against humanity, based on the draft articles that were adopted by the International Law Commission, and we hope that we can get action this October or November. And to conclude, accountability for international crimes should always be the norm, regardless of where they are committed. So to be clear, all international crimes, wherever and whenever perpetrated, are equally grave and should equally be punished. In this regard, we call on all states that support the call for accountability in Ukraine and elsewhere to adhere to the Rome Statute and to accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. This has been mentioned by several delegations today. Mexico is proud to belong to the group of states that have done this, but we believe that this is only congruent with the message and calls that we have heard today and in the past weeks. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
I thank you, Madam President. China's position on the Ukraine issue has been consistent and clear. We believe the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine, should be respected. The purpose and principles of the UN Charter should be upheld. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to a peaceful settlement of the crisis should be supported. The prospect of a prolonged and extended conflict is worrying. We're especially saddened to see the reports on civilian casualties and killings. Under international humanitarian law, civilians should be spared of any forms of violence in armed conflicts. Attacks against civilians are unacceptable and should not occur. The related circumstances and specific causes of civilian death should be verified and established. At the same time, Any accusations should be based on facts. Before the full picture is clear, all sides should exercise restraint and avoid unfounded accusations. Dialogue and negotiation is the only way out for peace. China calls on Russia and Ukraine to adhere to the direction of dialogue and negotiation, overcome difficulties and differences, and accumulate conditions for an early ceasefire. The international community should focus on supporting diplomatic negotiations and do more to ease the tensions instead of aggravating conflicts. We welcome Secretary General Guterres' visit to Russia and Ukraine and support him in his diplomatic engagement with all parties. China will continue its constructive efforts in solving the Ukraine crisis. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of China and give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you so much. Many of the participants of today's meeting praised International Criminal Court, which is interesting, since at least two of the co-sponsors of today's meeting, the United States and the United Kingdom, did everything imaginable to shield their own military from the ICC's reach. Both countries developed protective legislation. American law is so far that it was nicknamed among Western legal professionals as the Hague Invasion Act. Political pressure, financial leverage, and even imposing personal sanctions on the ICC prosecutor, all these led to the desired outcome. Investigations into war crimes committed by soldiers of these countries in Iraq and Afghanistan were quote-unquote deprioritized by ICC. This is a rather sophisticated term for a very simple thing, namely not doing anything. This perfectly illustrates both the real degree of ICC's impartiality and objectivity, as well as hypocrisy of US and UK, who all of a sudden started to support the court and pour millions of dollars there as donations. Such an attitude turns justice into farce, paid for verdicts by paid for court. International perception of ICC's role and stance was well demonstrated by Ukraine. Its declaration on acceptance of its jurisdiction, dated 8 September 2015, represents an ill-famous attempt not only to limit the court's jurisdiction, but also to assign the blame in advance, before a formal investigation even started. Like we said, ICC is a merely political instrument and has nothing in common with justice. In light of today's remarks of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, we would like to note that it has become a tradition for various fact-finding missions established by OHCHR to conduct their business without physical presence in the respective country. In this regard, their methods of work presuppose reliance on information provided by NGOs, as well as available in the open domain, namely the internet. Working in this manner, it's literally impossible to distinguish between the truth and myriads of fakes. We would be hesitant to draw any conclusions based on information of that quality. Today, we also heard about the role of NGOs and civil society. This role has indeed been very prominent. The West mobilized a real fake news factory to produce new lies 24/7 to create a parallel reality of what is happening in Ukraine. All of the fakes mentioned today were refuted multiple times. Bucha provocation, by the way, got a new twist. According to The Guardian, most victims were not cold-bloodedly shot, as it had been claimed for at least 3 weeks already, but rather killed by artillery anti-personnel shells filled with small darts called fléchettes, from the French word standing for a small arrow. It's the same type of shell that Ukraine has been using to bombard Donbass since 2014. There is a lot of evidence about that in the internet. It seems that Western media will have to forget the word Bucha just as quickly as they forgot and banned the word Kramatorsk. It was another prominent fake. Everyone from day one had been confidently blaming Russia for a missile strike on a railway station, killing 50 and injuring 100 civilians, until the serial number of the missile surfaced in the social networks, identifying it beyond any doubt as Ukrainian, used by the same military unit that bombarded civilian targets in Donbass. Anyone is raising the issue about Ukraine's accountability for Kramatorsk now? Any NGOs or civil society or maybe mainstream media? Complete and shameful, or rather shameless, silence. And so we thought. What we heard today was another portion of unsubstantiated claims and even fakes seasoned with lies, hypocrisy, and pompous rhetoric. If you want to learn the truth about real situation on the ground, come to our ARIA Formula meeting on May 6. We plan to give the floor to some independent voices working on the front line to demonstrate you facts, not fakes. Lastly, I would like to stress the flow of fake news will not shield Ukrainian neo-Nazis, foreign mercenaries, and their sponsors from accountability for heinous crimes. Multiple witness statements and evidence to that effect are being collected right now across Ukraine, including in Mariupol. Witnesses confirm inter alia routine military use by Ukraine military and nationalist battalions of schools and even kindergartens, as well as other civilian objects. Ukrainian military are not ashamed to do that. They post photos of their military positions there online. I used to collect such posts as evidence, but stopped doing that because they were way too numerous and just keep coming. Ukrainian military and nationalist battalions also routinely use civilians as human shields, on the extent compared only to ISIS tactics. But here it's even worse, because Ukrainian military are doing that to their compatriots. And yes, torture centers in 21st century are truly unthinkable. There is a lot of factual evidence as well as witness statements about SBU-operated secret torture center in Mariupol airport. It was cynically named the library, and it was created in 2014 when Azov Nationalist Battalion moved into Mariupol. This specific center was used to torture, rape, and kill the books. That's how neo-Nazis called the prisoners there. Ordinary civilians who were suspected of being non-loyal to Kiev regime. Rest assured, perpetrators of these and all other heinous crimes will be brought to justice. No one will escape personal responsibility, and denazification of Ukraine will be completed. I thank you.
After hearing the representative of the Russian Federation, I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Madam Chair and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Albania, I thank you for giving me the floor and express appreciation for your delegation's organization of this area formula meeting. I also acknowledge the presence of Her Excellency Emin Japarova, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine. My delegation has taken note of the briefings by Ms. Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Mr. Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. We also thank all the other briefers for their contributions to this discussion. Like any other war, the war in Ukraine has regrettably brought to the surface the ugliness of conflict and its adverse impact on innocent civilian populations. In situations of war, there are many things that get out of control, and it is in this context that we reiterate our call for emphasis to be placed on the diplomatic track in addressing the situation in Ukraine. A protraction of the conflict risks degeneration and further complication of realigned global interests, which could have dire impact on the people of Ukraine. The war has, however, seen the perpetration of violations that need to be brought into the realm of accountability. The reported incidents of atrocious breaches of the sanctity of the rules of international law that govern the conduct of modern warfare cannot be left in the sphere of impunity. It has implications for the victims, the cause of justice, and the maintenance of peace and security. Consequently, we reiterate our position on the need to conduct thorough, transparent, and independent investigations to establish the facts and build relevant evidence for the prosecution of all persons whose acts of commission or omission during the war in Ukraine constitute crimes under international law. Also, we underscore the need for timely collection and preservation of empirical information and data to support an effective accountability mechanism. The highly fluid situation in Ukraine demands timely gathering of evidence that would be admissible for the purposes of attributing international crimes to suspected perpetrators. The media and civil society, notwithstanding the personal risk they're exposed to, have made efforts to painstakingly document real-time evidence which could enhance the prospects for successful prosecutions. Such sources need to be properly vetted and documented for purposes of prosecution. Furthermore, multilateral cooperation remains a crucial element for ensuring accountability for the international crimes and violations that have been committed in Ukraine. Both political and financial support of the international community are needed to ensure the greatest measure of successful prosecution. Additionally, enhanced coordination and cooperation among member states and with regional bodies would be necessary to avoid duplications, overburdening witnesses, and to ensure cost effectiveness. In concluding, we encourage the development of the capacity for the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine in furtherance of her avowed commitment to uphold the laws and deliver justice to all Ukrainian people who require it in these extraordinary and painful circumstances. International support would be needed to bring this very difficult task to fruition. I thank you for giving me the floor.
I thank the representative of Ghana, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Je vous remercie, Madame la modérateur. I wish to thank Albania and France for organizing this important area formula meeting. I also wish to join other Security Council members in thanking the briefers for their contributions. I wish to quote the High Commissioner, Mrs. Bachelet, the ICC prosecutor, the prosecutor of Ukraine, the lawyer, Mrs. Amal Clooney, human rights lawyer, and Mrs. Kenneth Ruff from civil society, as well as Human Rights Watch. Gabon is in principle in favor of all initiatives that are aiming at establishing violations of international law covenants, such as international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international law for refugees. In this regard, and based on the recommendations of Secretary General of the United Nations, we believe all efforts should be geared toward establishing alleged crimes committed in the context of the war in Ukraine. It would be important that in this delicate endeavor, any step should be taken to make sure the process is exempt from exasperation, strategic bias, partiality, and propaganda. We support an independent inquiry through the entire process, at the end of which the process of assuring accountability could only be taken. We look forward to working closely with other members from Security Council and General Assembly in attempting to solve this pending and unnecessary matter. Je vous remercie. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon, and I would now like to open the floor to members of the UN who wish to take the floor. Given the late hour, we would be very grateful if you could limit your statements to 2 minutes or submit your statements in writing. We will be circulating a summary of all interventions of this ARIA Formula meeting, so you're welcome to submit the full version of your statement in writing. I would like to give now the floor to the representative of the European Union. Ambassador, you have the floor.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the late hour, and I appreciate the fact that we need to be brief, and that the purpose of today's conversation is to listen to the excellent briefers and to try to define what action is needed to assure accountability. So I will skip the parts of my statement that were a description of the situation, because I think the briefers had done that in all its details, horrendous as much of it is. But let's remember the starting point here. The General Assembly has asked for Russia to cease hostilities, but what we have seen is intensified shelling of schools, hospitals, and residential buildings. The perpetrators need to be held to account, and I agree with everyone who has said that this is not just about the situation in Ukraine. The accountability for atrocity crimes committed anywhere in the world should be followed up. But today focus is on Ukraine. So what do we do moving forward? Well, I think one starting point is to back up the ICC prosecutor, and we welcome the work that he's been doing. So let's back him up. Secondly, we need to launch investigations at national level. The national prosecutors of Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine have joined efforts into a joint investigation team, enabling them to exchange information and facilitate investigation into war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other core crimes. The European Union Agency for Criminal Justice, Cooperation Eurojust, as some have mentioned, supports this joint investigation team. Furthermore, we have, as the EU, amended the mandate of the advisory mission in Ukraine so that it can provide support to the Office of the Prosecutor General and law enforcement agencies to facilitate the investigation and prosecution of international crimes. The advisory mission deploys 350 personnel to support civilian security sector reform since 2014. And of course, it will coordinate closely with the ICC and the Eurojust. There is massive body of evidence of alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed by the Russian military forces. Bucha, Borodyanka, Mariupol, Kramatorsk, the list is long. So let's get the facts. And as the prosecutor said, let's cling to the law. Colleagues, it's important to pool our efforts to gather evidence, collect testimonies to enable prosecution. We support all measures to ensure accountability for human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. In this regard, we welcome also the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry. That commission still needs support in funding in the Fifth Committee here in the UN. Ukraine's Prosecutor General has asked for international help in gathering evidence. We are grateful to all states that have lent their support by financial contributions, by seconding experts to ICC, and to enlarge the investigation team, or by sending forensic experts on the ground. Investigators from EU member states have arrived in Kiev and Lviv to assist the Ukrainian counterparts. States' cooperation is necessary to ensure that national prosecution and the ICC can perform the task they have been entrusted with, and that justice is served. Information sharing, coordination among different accountability mechanisms is also crucial, as many have said. Finally, the support also by non-state parties to the ICC is welcomed. This demonstrates the international community's resolve that the victims of the war in Ukraine will not be forgotten, and that their harrowing stories will be heard in court. Justice is slow, sometimes frustratingly so, but by working for accountability today, we will get there. and hopefully also prevent further escalation and further dissuade further crimes. I thank you very much, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of the EU and would now like to give the screen to the Minister of Denmark, who will be delivering a pre-recorded statement on behalf of the Group of Friends on Accountability in Ukraine.
I'm pleased to deliver this statement on behalf of the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine, consisting of 48 member states and the European Union. Since the 24th of February, we have witnessed images and reports of numerous atrocities, including indiscriminate killings of civilians, women, children, and elderly, as well as attacks on civilian infrastructure. We are horrified by the reports from Bucha, the strike on the Kramatorsk railway station, and the widespread reports of sexual and gender-based violence. As underlined by the UN Secretary General, such attacks are gross violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, for which the perpetrators must be held accountable. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is already investigating the situation. The UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine will investigate violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, and the 3 experts appointed under the OSCE Moscow mechanism have recently delivered their report, citing a clear pattern of violations of international humanitarian law and the basic human rights by Russian forces. These efforts are complemented by national investigations and the important work carried out on the ground by OCHA and civil society actors to collect and preserve evidence. The Group of Friends will support these efforts to bring war criminals to justice. We acknowledge this journey can sometimes be long and costly. It can take years, and we will be there to sustain the process, no matter how many years. While we pursue the legal path of accountability, the UN Security Council and General Assembly can and should express their concerns and condemnation of the unprovoked acts of aggression, the attacks on innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure, reports of human rights violations, and breaches of humanitarian law. Our quest for justice, our fight against impunity for violations of international law should not, must not, and cannot be pursued without collectively taking a stand against a powerful aggressor. It is therefore only appropriate to react politically in real time against Russia, given credible reports that its military forces are committing atrocities against civilians. Today, we underline the importance of ensuring accountability for these crimes. Without accountability, crimes will continue and impunity will persist, undermining legitimacy and the prospect for future peace and reconciliation. Thank you.
I thank Foreign Minister Kofod for his statement on behalf of the Group of Friends. I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Finland to deliver a statement on behalf of Nordic countries. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Madam Chair, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. On 2nd March, the General Assembly, by an overwhelming majority, deplored in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of the Charter. Russia's aggression is not only illegal and unprovoked, we also see shocking reports of atrocity crimes, including allegations of sexual violence, which are all acts unequivocally prohibited under international law. There cannot be impunity for the most serious international crimes. All perpetrators must be brought to justice. This is necessary to ensure justice for victims, but also to deter future violations. The Nordic countries were among those state parties that referred the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court. The ICC plays a central role in our collective response at the international level. We welcome the fast mobilization of the ICC prosecutor in the situation of Ukraine. Echoing the ICC prosecutor, the only agenda is the truth. The ICC, however, is a court of last resort. Insofar as possible, the most serious crimes under international law should be investigated and prosecuted in national jurisdictions. Ukraine, despite being a nation under attack, has made a tremendous effort to document the most serious international crimes on its territory. We must support Ukraine in these efforts. A number of countries have also initiated criminal investigations under universal jurisdiction, complementing the efforts undertaken in Ukraine nationally and the ICC internationally. Many civil society organizations are also working to document and collect evidence. Coordination and cooperation will remain key in order to ensure effective investigations. Madam President, in addition to individual criminal responsibility, we must also bear in mind that every internationally wrongful act of a state entails the international responsibility of that state. We must invoke Russia's responsibility for the violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. This is being advanced by various mechanisms, including under the UN Human Rights Council and the OSCE. We also remind the Security Council of its power and duty to decisively respond to threats to international peace and security. We strongly encourage the Council to remain seized of the situation in Ukraine, also in order to advance accountability. Ensuring accountability is an integral part of our obligation to respect and ensure compliance for human rights and international human rights law. Central instruments of human rights and international humanitarian law were drafted over 70 years ago and are customary international law and standards. The obligation to protect civilians is as important as ever. Ensuring accountability is also key to bringing about durable peace. Future peace requires action now. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of Finland and would like to give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands for a pre-recorded statement.
Bullet holes can be filled in, walls can be rebuilt, and roofs can be repaired. But some damage cannot be fixed. The physical and mental trauma caused by sexual violence. Trauma that women, and sometimes men, carry with them for the rest of their lives. There is growing evidence that Russian troops have been using sexual violence as a weapon of war. And the gruesome testimonies of girls and women are hard to bear and go beyond our comprehension. This violence was not aimed at military targets. Its only purpose was to destroy people's souls. Violence against humanity itself. These crimes must not go unpunished. And that is why I am grateful to Albania, France, Ukraine, for organizing this important event. And that is why we call on the ICC to bring to justice those who have committed these atrocious crimes. Not only because we owe it to the victims, but because impunity leads to more violence, and to more impunity, and to yet more violence. And we cannot allow that. Justice must be done. We all agree on this. We've all said it. And we all know that getting there is much harder than just saying it. Because getting there means doing more. And we must do more to protect women and girls, more to ensure that justice actually works by strengthening the mechanisms that lead to prosecution, by professionalizing the rules and standards for evidence gathering, and by raising awareness that evidence must meet a certain standard of proof. In Ukraine, the destructive power of violence is being countered by the power of courageous people, of the countless NGOs and citizen groups who are collecting and sharing videos, photos, and other material. Of the citizens who are writing to my ministry with evidence. Their combined strength is driven by justice, and it must lead to justice. The international community has an important role to play here. Together, we must ensure that the road to accountability and peace is a durable one. That justice is not only our desired endpoint, but that we actually get there. Because justice is a journey, not just a destination. Thank you very much.
I thank Foreign Minister Hostra for his statement, and I give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania for a pre-recorded statement.
Mrs. President, distinguished colleagues, Romania welcomes the initiative of Albania and France in cooperation with Ukraine to hold a meeting in the area formula on the topic of ensuring accountability for atrocities committed in Ukraine. Romania took every opportunity to strongly condemn the brutal, unjustified, and unprovoked illegal military aggression directed by Moscow against Ukraine. The humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. The conflict has caused the world's fastest-growing displacement crisis since the Second World War. More than 828,000 Ukrainian refugees have crossed the Romanian-Ukrainian border. On the ground, the traces of indisputable aggression against civilians speak louder than any words. I have just returned from Ukraine today, where I have visited, together with the Romanian Prime Minister and the Romanian Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies, the cities of Irpin and Borodianka. I am personally still very much affected by what I saw on the ground. We are horrified by the reported war crimes, crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine, and we call once more on the Russian Federation to stop its unlawful and unacceptable behavior towards the civilian population. No perpetrator of the atrocities in Ukraine shall remain unpunished. It gives us real hope to see an unprecedented unified response on behalf of the international community in support of holding accountable all those involved in blatant violations of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights. Romania has therefore joined other states parties to the Rome Statute in a referral to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to investigate any acts of war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide that have occurred on the territory of Ukraine. In addition, the Romanian government has recently approved a voluntary financial contribution of €100,000 in response to the ICC prosecutor's appeal to states parties. We stand ready to support further the efforts of the office with adequate resources against the background of increased workloads, including the new investigation on the territory of Ukraine. Romania places its full trust in the independent and impartial ability of the ICC to bring justice in Ukraine and all the other situations under its consideration. We will continue to support its vital role in the fight against impunity and in providing assistance and reparations to victims of mass atrocities. Romania also welcomed the order of the International Court of Justice of March 16, calling on the Russian Federation to immediately suspend military operations in the territory of Ukraine. We urge full and unequivocal compliance with this order. Furthermore, Romania will continue to promote its declaration calling for a broader recognition of the ICJ's jurisdiction, and we encourage all states to join us in our démarche. We will not stop here. Romania supports targeted efforts to investigate human rights and international humanitarian law violations, such as the establishment of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine and the invocation of the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE. In addition, Romania became a member of the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine. The international community must continue to stand firm against Russia's unacceptable aggression and to stand united in protecting those who are already suffering or facing imminent threats. We must continue to condemn and publicly expose the attacks against civilians and civilian facilities in Ukraine. In addition, it is our duty to address Russian war propaganda and disinformation more effectively, to never turn a blind eye on attempts to relativize the truth of sufferance. We should continue to appropriately respond to Ukraine's needs and to the specific requests of all international bodies and mechanisms that we have set up with the aim of contributing to more accountability as regards the situation in Ukraine. Our commitment has to be consistent and long-standing. Fatigue is not acceptable in the pursuit of justice. We should also ensure that the existing mechanisms and platforms for accountability do not overlap and do not create gaps in investigation. The activity of the Group of Friends on Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine could be particularly useful to this effect. Finally, we have to help the victims with compassion and dignity. Romania has been at the forefront of this effort as one of the countries receiving very large numbers of Ukrainians fleeing the terror since the beginning of the war. Romania is committed to continue helping the population in need, be it on the territory of Ukraine or as beneficiaries of international protection on our territory. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Foreign Minister Arescu for his statement, and I'd like to give the floor to Deputy Foreign Minister of Lithuania for a pre-recorded statement.
Excellencies, we are grateful to the permanent missions of Albania and France for convening this area formula meeting in cooperation with Ukraine, and thank the panel of remarkable briefers for their inspiring contributions to this discussion. Lithuania aligns itself with the statement of the United Nations Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine. We will continuously contribute to the activities of the group both here in New York and in Geneva. At the birth of the United Nations in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was said, "Never again." Unfortunately, after numerous bloody conflicts of the past several decades, a war is once again unleashed on the continent of Europe, with an extreme brutality and devastation brought forth by Russia all across Ukraine. As we enter into the third month of this war, reports by the United Nations officials, civil society, and journalists speak of gross and revolting violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The images of mass graves, bodies on the streets burned beyond recognition, and evidence of sexual and gender-based violence, including rape, targeted killings, torture, arbitrary arrests, abductions, enforced disappearances, use of cluster munitions in residential areas, as well as mass deportations of civilians into the Russian territory, contribute to the mounting statistics of death and devastation. We also mourn the international journalists and media workers killed by Russian troops. They tell a heart-rending, yet unfortunately still ongoing story. This war has far-reaching consequences for many regions in the world, beginning from threats to nuclear safety and fears of use of chemical weapons to already felt hardships to food security. As underlined by the United Nations Secretary General, those directly responsible for war, crimes, and crimes against humanity, violations of human rights, and international humanitarian law on Ukrainian soil must be held accountable. There will be no impunity. There will be accountability for this horror, and international justice will be done. Victims will have access to remedy and to justice. Lithuania condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's war against Ukraine and will continue to steadfastly support all efforts to ensure independent and effective investigations into crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. Russia and its accomplice Belarus bear full responsibility for this large-scale, unprovoked, unlawful, and unjustified war of aggression. We recall that Russia must comply with the 16th of March binding order of the International Court of Justice and immediately suspend the military operations in the whole internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Lithuania actively supported and voted for the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry by the United Nations Human Rights Council. It will be up to us, the UN member states, to ensure its adequate funding, as well as to encourage its practical cooperation with the UN special procedures and mandate holders. We welcome the work conducted under the OSCE Moscow mechanism. It is now upon the OSCE participating states and the international community to ensure the follow-up actions to be undertaken. Lithuania, as the first member state to refer the situation in Ukraine to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, will continue to support the Office of the Prosecutor in its investigation concerning alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine. Fact-finding and evidence-gathering forms the cornerstone to fighting impunity. We maintain that cooperation between the national investigators based on universal jurisdiction is enhancing the documenting and mapping of the crimes committed and identifying those responsible. We suggest that the good practices of cooperation can serve as an impactful source of assistance to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, as the ICC does not possess independent enforcement powers and relies on the member states for their support. The national authorities need coordination of investigation actions, share the information and workload, avoid repetitive actions, allocate resources, transfer data and evidence between each other and to the International Criminal Court prosecutor. We need to use common approach on the procedures of evidence collection to ensure their admissibility and reliability. A coordinated work with an involvement of civil society, journalists, media, workers, and NGOs is essential. At the initiative of Lithuania, the joint investigation team into allegations of international crimes committed in Ukraine was created in Eurojust in March. It comprises Ukrainian, Polish, and Lithuanian representatives. The team will support the gathering of evidence, as well as its swift and secure exchange. We highly welcome the decision of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to join the joint investigation team. We invite the member states that started national investigations based on universal jurisdiction to consider joining it. We will double down on our efforts of investigating all further legal avenues. Minister of Justice of Lithuania will host an international conference on the 6th of May that will be dedicated to discussion of all legal mechanisms that could ensure accountability of Putin's and Lukashenko's regimes for the crime of aggression. We, the international community, must seek full accountability for the atrocities committed in Ukraine. In order for us to honorably follow our words with deeds, we must continue to defend the Charter, the international law, human rights, peace and security, and our own humanity itself. I thank you.
I thank Deputy Minister Adomenas for his statement, and the last pre-recorded statement is from the State Secretary of Montenegro.
Madam Chairperson, I would like to begin by thanking you for convening today's area meeting on this exceedingly critical issue. I also take the opportunity to thank today's briefers for their valuable inputs to this debate. Montenegro aligns itself with the statement made by Danish Foreign Minister on behalf of the group of friends of accountability following the aggression against Ukraine. But I would nonetheless like to accentuate certain points of importance to us. We are deeply troubled and unsettled by the widespread images and reports of indiscriminate killings of civilians, including the most vulnerable ones, as well as the attacks on civilian infrastructure by the Russian Federation. The execution of innocent and unarmed civilians in Bucha and the shelling of the Kramatorsk railway station is not only a war crime, it constitutes a defeat of civilization values and the rules-based international order, principles at the very heart of the aggression of Ukraine and the very ones we fought to achieve and preserve throughout the years. Such onslaught represents a blatant and audacious violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, for which we seek and demand accountability. Montenegro welcomes the ongoing investigation of the International Criminal Court's prosecutor in Ukraine, reiterates its support for engagement of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, especially OHCHR and the civil society organizations. Actions undertaken by these actors are indispensable in terms of collecting crucial evidence of the ramification of the Russian unprecedented aggression. We call on the international community to vocally and continually express its condemnation and denunciation of this unprovoked act of warm ongoing attacks on civilians and critical infrastructure, human rights violation, and infringement of humanitarian law. Madam Chairperson, we must have accountability if we are to end impunity and give peace and reconciliation a chance. The victory against impunity is not something achieved overnight and without breaking a sweat. Still, I propose that it can be accomplished if pursued with determination and a united stance against the perpetrator. Montenegro stands ready to do its part. Thank you very much.
I thank State Secretary Mishurovic for his statement. And before we continue, seeing how we are past the limit of time that we had allocated for this meeting, and seeing how there was not much that we could do with the pre-recorded statements, I would like to kindly ask the participants in the room to limit their statements to 1 minute, if possible. And I also encourage speakers to deposit their statements with our team in case they choose not to speak. But I'm asking for your understanding because we have to conclude by 6:30. And having said that, I would like to give the floor to the representative of Italy. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The unjustified military aggression of Russia against Ukraine is shaking the fundamental pillars of the rules-based international order. Italy has the view that accountability is key to making sure that these pillars, now shaken, will not be irreversibly damaged. To this end, several routes must be followed. I will mention shortly 4 of these routes. First, we must make sure that those who are responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine are brought to justice before competent domestic courts and, if needed, before the International Criminal Court. Second, we emphasize that aggression is in itself an international crime, entailing the individual responsibility of those orchestrating the military attack against a sovereign country. Last year, Italy ratified the Kampala Amendment to the Rome Statute, activating the jurisdiction of the court over the crime of aggression. We call on all states parties to follow suit and non-state parties to ratify the Rome Statute, including the Kampala Amendment. Third, Italy fully supports Ukraine legal action against the Russian Federation before the International Court of Justice. The Russian Federation is bound under international law to comply with the judgments and decisions of the ICJ, including the order of 16 March this year to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. Last, the fourth point, Italy also supports the collection of evidence by both the OSCE Moscow Mechanism and the Independent Commission of Inquiry, established by the Human Rights Council, as well as the work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Missions in Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I would like to give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you. Russia's aggression against Ukraine, facilitated by Belarus, require accountability for the grave violations of international human rights law, international humanitarian law. And every legal avenue available must and will be used to hold the aggressor to account. Latvia has engaged in several accountability mechanisms to address the mass atrocities being committed in Ukraine. Notably, Latvia has taken the decision to participate as a third party in the case related to allegation of genocide brought by Ukraine against Russia before International Court of Justice. And Latvia is one of 43 state parties to the International Criminal Court that have referred the situation in Ukraine to the prosecutor of ICC, enabling the prosecutor to proceed with investigations into allegations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide committed on any part of the territory of Ukraine by any person. We have also nominated national experts and provided voluntary contribution of 100,000 euros to the ICC in addressing the challenges the ICC is facing in the conduct of these and other investigations. We particularly welcome the decision of the Office of Prosecutor to join the joint investigation team on international crimes committed in Ukraine. Last but not least, in exercising the universal jurisdiction, the State Security Service of Latvia has launched criminal proceedings for war crimes and crimes against humanity and peace committed by Russian armed forces in Ukraine to obtain and document evidence. We likewise welcome the establishment of International Commission of Inquiry in Ukraine to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law. The last thought, while Russia's economy is plummeting due to the most severe sanctions in history being imposed on Russia because of its war against Ukraine and atrocities against its people, it seems that the main export good of Russia continues to be the human rights violations. We have to stop that export like we have to stop export of Russia's coal, oil, and gas. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of Latvia and would like to give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We thank Albania, France, and Ukraine for convening today's ARIA meeting that Estonia is honored to co-sponsor. Estonia aligns itself with the statements by the European Union and the Accountability Group of Friends. Madam Chair, it has been over 2 months since Nazi Russia started the unprovoked, absolutely illegitimate full-scale war on Ukraine. Russian forces are committing unspeakable barbarities against Ukraine and the Ukrainians that have been rightfully prohibited under international law because they are inhumane. Estonia has always been a strong supporter of the International Criminal Court that forms an important pillar of the rules-based international order, and we welcome the investigation by the ICC in Ukraine. Estonia has also started a domestic structural investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine and is cooperating with Eurojust in this regard. We continue to call on Russia to abide by the order of the International Court of Justice for Russia to immediately suspend the military operations that it commenced on 24th of February on the territory of Ukraine. It is crucial that evidence of war crimes committed in Ukraine continues to be gathered in a manner that will hold up in independent, impartial judicial institutions. All of the information collected needs to be made available to the relevant accountability mechanisms and courts. Accountability mechanisms need to cooperate and complement each other's mandates. The destabilizing effects of Russia's aggression are felt throughout the world. The only country that needs to stop the senseless war is the instigator, the Russian Federation. The individuals perpetrating atrocities will need to stop executing unlawful orders or face the consequences. The world is watching and is united in horror. We stand with Ukraine. We mourn every life lost due to senseless Russian aggression. We need to do more to save Ukrainian lives already now while we work hard for justice to be done. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of Estonia and give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Madam Minister. I will make my full statement available, but let me make 3 points which are important to me today. The first is, despite the numerous Russian attempts to spread disinformation, including in this meeting and at all levels, in an equalized manner, it is clear that we have ongoing and everyday fresh reports about crimes committed by the Russian forces and related groups or organizations. And it is very important that we go into this issue and collect evidence to make the perpetrators accountable. My second point is that we, of course, in this context, think that the investigations by the International Criminal Court prosecutor are extremely important, and we will have provided and will provide additional means and personnel, financial means and personnel to carry on with this. And of course, we have also foreseen additional funding for the mission of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Ukraine. And my last point, to be short, Germany will remain firmly committed to supporting all efforts in the context of accountability everywhere in the world, on the globe, and we owe it to the victims of these atrocious crimes and to their families. Thank you.
I thank you, Ambassador. and would like to give the floor to the representative of Croatia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will reduce my intervention to only a couple of questions and a simpler and clear answer. If there were accountability for aggression and annexation of Crimea in 2014 and crimes committed in Donbas from 2014 onwards, would there be a new wave of aggression and atrocity crimes committed starting from February 24 this year? How many lives and human misery could have been spared? What will be the consequences if there is no accountability this time yet again? Will in a couple of years Kiev be wiped off the face of earth as this time Mariupol is? Would some other European or non-European capital be wiped out as well? Distinguished colleagues, it is my firm belief that if there is no accountability for atrocity crimes committed in Ukraine, atrocities will never end. They can only worsen. We need accountability, and we need to fight for it now. It brings justice for victims as well as prevents future atrocities. It is going to be a long and challenging way, but as Dag Hammarskjöld once said, future is the horizon, but also the first step that we will take tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I would like to give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Madam Chair, also for the sake of the debate, I will provide the full statement in writing. I just want to say a few sentences on behalf of Poland. Firstly, we do believe that the only way to prevent the further suffering is to fully implement the resolution entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. And we believe that all bodies of the UN system should treat its provisions as a guidance and obligation. This is the voice of the international community expressly presented in this resolution. Secondly, while, as you all know, most of Poland's activities are now focused on the humanitarian aid related to hosting the largest number of refugees in the history on Polish soil, as a Poland, we're also taking steps to bring the perpetrators to justice, acting on the international and also on the national level. In that regard, firstly, I want to say also that as the OSCE chairmanship in office, Poland decided to hold discussions and consideration on the organization, including the regular human dimension events, as a relevant and useful response to the atrocities committed in Ukraine. Also, as an OSCE chairmanship, we welcome the report drawn by the OSCE Moscow mechanism experts, Professors Wolfgang Benedek, Weronika Bilkova, and Marco Sassoli, being at the same time extremely concerned by the appalling reality that it describes. The document confirms patterns of violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law committed by the Russian Federation during the aggression against Ukraine. Then, of course, we express satisfaction with the UN Human Rights Council established a dedicated commission of inquiry whose experts have been already appointed, and we heard them today, and we fully support their work and look forward for its outcome. Then, of course, at domestic level, Polish National Prosecutor's Office opened an investigation into Russia's crime of war of aggression against Ukraine, which is penalized under the Polish law. Together with Ukraine, Lithuania, we established the joint investigation team, which operates within the framework of Eurojust in order to collect and preserve evidence of crimes committed to Ukraine. And of course, we decided also to respond positively to an invitation extended by the ICC prosecutor to provide assistance to the office, including through the provision of national experts on a secondment basis and the voluntary contributions in order to address office's urgent needs. As far as the state responsibility is concerned, we welcome the decision of the ICJ issued on the 16th March on provisional measures in the case of Ukraine versus Russia concerning the allegations of the genocide under the Convention of the Prevention of and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Provision measures are legally binding, therefore Russia's failure to comply with them bluntly shows their disrespect for the law and international institutions. And just let me finish by expressing, as our German colleague said, we fully support all the efforts for accountability, also all the efforts for accountability against the lies that we also, it's more than misinformation, it is the lies that we also heard today in this room. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I also thank you for your understanding and cooperation and submitting a full statement in writing. I would like now to give the floor to the representative of Belgium.
Madame la Ministre. Tout d'abord, la Belgique remercie nos amis albanais et français pour l'organisation de cette importante réunion. Belgium fully aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and by the Group of Friends on Accountability. And we wish to make 3 additional remarks. First, since Russia's unjustified and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine in February, reports of attacks on civilians, including children, have been growing. There have been numerous reports of conflict-related gender-based violence. We strongly call for the respect of the rule of law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law by all parties involved in the conflict. And we further reaffirm our solidarity with Ukraine and with the Ukrainian people. Secondly, Madam Minister, my country considers it necessary to conduct investigations and to gather evidence which will allow justice to be served. My delegation commends the efforts undertaken by the Prosecutor General of Ukraine to investigate these facts. And Belgium also welcomes the cooperation within the framework of coordination organized by Eurojust, in which our Belgian Federal Prosecutor's Office is actively participating. The findings are clear. The OSCE report mentions confirmed cases of violations of international humanitarian law. We further look forward to the results of the commissions of inquiry established by the Human Rights Council, and I would like here to add that it is vital that that commission receives the funding it needs to function properly. Belgium is one of the 41 states that referred the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court last March. In this regard, Belgium has just announced a contribution of 500,000 euros to the trust fund created by the Office of the Prosecutor to enable it to cope with a significant increase in its workload. It is important to coordinate the various efforts underway to ensure that current initiatives are mutually reinforcing and meet sufficiently high standards so that the evidence collected can actually be used in criminal procedures. Finally, we are particularly concerned about the situation pertaining to children. Children are amongst the most vulnerable victims of armed conflicts. Hundreds of schools and educational facilities have been subjected to indiscriminate attacks, and too many children have died. We must ensure that the perpetrators of those crimes are held accountable. Unfortunately, children are still not given their rightful place in judicial proceedings. Belgium therefore calls for children to be systematically recognized as a full category of victims before national, hybrid, and international courts, as well as before transitional justice mechanisms. And to conclude, Madam Minister, Madam Chair, Belgium will remain committed to accountability for the most serious crimes under international law in all situations, and therefore also in Ukraine. In the immediate future, a cessation of hostilities is essential in order to prevent more civilians from becoming victims of this senseless war. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I would like to give the floor to the representative of Luxembourg.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Luxembourg is proud to have co-sponsored this area formula meeting organized by Albania and France in cooperation with Ukraine, with a strong focus on ensuring accountability for the atrocities committed in Ukraine. The reports that we receive show that indeed atrocities are being committed by the Russian armed forces in Ukraine, including rape and other forms of sexual violence targeting in particular women and children. We must do everything possible to hold the perpetrators accountable and to bring justice to the victims, who must be at the center of our efforts. The important documentation work underway is crucial in this regard, and we salute the courage and resilience of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine and her teams, working relentlessly to document violations as they occur. Luxembourg supported the establishment by the Human Rights Council of the Commission of Inquiry, and we were glad to hear today that the Commission is about to start its work. We were also among the many states that have referred the situation in Ukraine to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and we thank Prosecutor Khan for his very clear statement today. Luxembourg has just announced a voluntary contribution of 100,000 euros to the ICC. It remains essential to provide the court with the necessary resources to fulfill its important mandate in Ukraine as well as in all other situations. In conclusion, Luxembourg remains committed to standing by the people of Ukraine, its partners and the international judicial bodies to prevent impunity and ensure effective and impartial justice for the atrocities that are being committed in Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I'd also like to thank the representative of Liechtenstein, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and Switzerland as well for submitting their statements in writing. I would like to give the floor to the representative of Australia.
Thank you indeed, Minister, and this is a sadly necessary meeting which Australia is pleased to co-sponsor as a member of the Accountability Group of Friends. And the briefers have given us insights into the complexities and challenges in holding perpetrators to account, but we must persevere. And Australia yet again condemns the Russian Federation's unprovoked, unjust and illegal invasion of Ukraine. And we yet again call on Russia to immediately withdraw its forces consistent with the legally binding decision of the International Court of Justice. Minister, Russia has committed egregious war crimes across Ukraine, and we're all appalled by the horrific acts, torture, mass executions, rape, shelling civilians, forced deportations of adults, forced deportations of children, starving cities through siege. The list of atrocities grows daily. It's imperative that we ensure accountability for the crimes committed in Ukraine, and that's why Australia joined over 40 Rome Statute states parties to refer the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court. And Australia strongly supports Prosecutor Khan opening an investigation, and we're pleased to support his office at this exceptionally challenging time, including through our decision to send professional staff to assist with his work. And Australia has joined global partners in imposing far-reaching sanctions to inflict heavy costs on those responsible or those who hold levers of power. Chair, the international community stands in solidarity with Ukraine. Russia's violations of international law will not be met with impunity. Thank you.
I thank you, Ambassador, and I would also like to thank the representative of Canada and the Republic of Korea for submitting their statements in writing. I would like to give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President. In the interest of time, I will just refer to the salient points of my statement, which we will submit in full in writing. I thank Albania and France for this meeting. As members of the Group of Friends on Accountability in Ukraine, we welcome today's discussion. Malta aligns herself with the statement by the European Union and would like to deliver a few salient points in our national capacity. Madam President, the indiscriminate shelling of civilian infrastructure and the bombing of schools and hospitals is completely unacceptable and the violation of international humanitarian law. All reports of atrocities, war crimes must be investigated. Accountability goes beyond the judicial process, and the Security Council and the General Assembly have crucial roles to play. The report delivered by the OSCE Moscow mechanism underlining the clear pattern of humanitarian and human rights violations is of grave concern and another pillar in the accountability mechanisms which are available to member states. Malta joins the unprecedented referral to the ICC to investigate what is happening in Ukraine and welcomes the rapid action taken by the prosecutor to open an investigation. We believe this is work of vital importance for the international community. Also, the establishment of a commission of inquiry by the Human Rights Council was another important step. Madam President, as a direct result of the unjustified and unprovoked aggression by Russia against Ukraine, neighboring countries have also had to step up to offer shelter, aid, and assistance to millions of Ukrainians who have been fleeing their homes. This is the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. We extend our appreciation to them, as well as to several UN agencies who have been working on the ground to offer assistance to the millions of internally displaced persons in Ukraine. Finally, Madam President, to ensure accountability, it is important that the right steps are taken from the very beginning. We urge the UN Security Council to fulfill its mandate in preserving peace and security and ask all member states to ensure that accountability remains on the UN agenda, being an effective means in upholding international law. Thank you.
I thank you, Ambassador, and I would like to remind you that at this moment we still have 4 speakers and some 5 minutes of time left, so I'm sure you will help me to conclude in time. I would like to give the floor to the representative of Bulgaria, hoping for your understanding and cooperation, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Bulgaria aligns itself with the statement made on behalf of the European Union on behalf of the Group of Friends of Accountability. I would like to thank you for organizing this area meeting on a topic of extreme importance which should remain high on the agenda. I would also like to thank the briefers for their very sobering interventions. Since the early morning of 24th of February, when the Russian Federation initiated this senseless, unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine, in complete violation of international law and the principles of the UN Charter, the lives of millions of Ukrainians have been literally destroyed. There have been daily reports of numerous civilians' casualties and of attacks of schools, hospitals, residential buildings, and civilian objects, which all constitute gross violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. Words fail to describe the images that emerged from Bucha. According to Human Rights Watch researcher, nearly every corner in Bucha is now a crime scene, and it felt like that was everywhere. There is a growing number of reports on sexual and gender-based violence being used as a tactic of war. The situation of children is particularly worrisome. Those crimes cannot and should not be left without consequences. The perpetrators will be held accountable. The international community has to stand united to ensure that justice is served. Impunity is not an option. Investigations have already been undertaken by the ICC prosecutor as well as at national level in several countries. We need to unite forces to assist the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine and law enforcement agencies so that we can make sure that all evidence is properly collected and testimonies are well documented so that no crime goes unpunished. It is of equal importance, though, to keep the issue high on the political agenda in all possible fora. The international community has to make it explicitly clear that there is no room for impunity for the crimes in Ukraine or elsewhere. Only through ensuring that justice is served can we prevent such atrocities from happening again. We owe it to the victims, but most of all, we owe it to ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I would like to give the floor to the representative of Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the interest of time, we'll submit our full statement in writing. Let me reiterate that Georgia fully aligns itself with the statement made on behalf of the Group of Friends of Accountability, and I would like to highlight a few points. It is imperative that accountability is ensured for the gross violations of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law committed by Russia. We must avail of all relevant international legal mechanisms to ensure that justice is served for the crimes that Russia is committing. In this regard, as a co-sponsor of the respective HRC resolution, Georgia welcomes the establishment of an independent international commission of inquiry to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international law and related crimes in the context of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine. Georgia strongly supports the work of ICC and was among the states referring the situation in Ukraine to the court. We welcome the announcement of the ICC prosecutor to immediately proceed with an active investigation and look forward to further progress. I would like to reiterate our call on Russia to comply with the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice of March 16 to immediately stop aggression, withdraw all its forces from the whole territory of Ukraine, allow immediate, safe, and unfettered access of all international humanitarian and human rights mechanisms. Finally, we reiterate Georgia's unwavering support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea and Donbas, as well as for Ukraine's navigational rights in its territorial waters. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Georgia and give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, allow me to express on behalf of the government of Japan our sense of solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Japan, as co-hosting country of this meeting, vehemently condemns the killings of civilians and attacks on civilian infrastructure by Russia. The mass killing of innocent civilians, including children, women, journalists, and medical and humanitarian personnel, is a grave breach of international humanitarian law and constitutes war crimes. Perpetrators of such acts must be identified and held accountable. Japan has referred the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court, and we look forward to continued progress in the investigation by Prosecutor Khan. We would like to continue to contribute to the ICC's activities while maintaining close contact with the ICC and its state parties. Sustaining peace will never be achieved without tackling impunity. Japan will continue to work together with our partners to this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan and give the floor to the representative of Chile. Okay, the representative of Chile is not here. They will be submitting their statement in writing. And with that, I'd like to thank all our briefers and member states for their participation and contribution. We feel very encouraged by the level of interest and engagement on a matter of crucial importance, such as assuring accountability for atrocities committed in Ukraine. The legal threshold for providing war crimes and crimes against humanity is high, as most of you here said, and the system has in the past proved torturous in its proceedings and slow to deliver justice. But Ukraine and Russia are still at war, and to really respond to the scale of Russia's attack, we have to connect what is happening today to the violations from the past, to show how they have a way of repeating over and over again. We have to tell not just the stories of people hurt and killed in this war, but also the history, culture, and the way of life Putin is trying to wipe out. Our aim is one only: to ensure justice, both in normal courts and in the court of public opinion, which is a key ingredient to keep us alert and to mobilize political action to support justice everywhere. In thanking you once again for your active participation, this meeting is adjourned.
I concur with you.